Okay, so as I said, we'll now start the second panel discussion on justice, understanding manifestations of racism and racial discrimination in Asia and the Pacific region. And I'm pleased to present Dr. Tracie Keesee, who will moderate this second panel discussion. Dr. Keesee is co-chair of the United Nations International Independent Expert Mechanism to advance racial justice and equality in the context of law enforcement. She served for 25 years in the Denver Police Department and subsequently served as New York City Police Department's Deputy Commissioner of Training. She was the first ever Deputy Commissioner of Equity and Inclusion. She served as Project Director of the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, and was also adjunct professor at the University of Colorado, Denver, teaching courses on race, crime, and justice. And she's the co-founder, president, and chief operating officer at the Center for Policing Equity, which promotes police transparency and accountability. Dr. Keesee, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Oh my gosh. I'm feeling it. Good afternoon. All right, I'm going to say one more time. I didn't make that flight to come all the way here without good afternoon. So I know. And thank you so much for the introduction. I appreciate this. First of all, it's an honor to be here with all of you, my esteemed colleagues on this panel and folks here that are coming from the member states in the UN. So thank you. This panel discussion is about justice, something I think we all know a little bit about. I think something we've all experienced. So this will be a great conversation. During this panel discussion, we'll first discuss ways in which racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance occur in countries in Asia and the Pacific region, reflecting on the representations and experiences of Africans and people of African descent since early settlement until present day. We will also hear about challenges and good practices in ensuring access to justice, including reparatory justice and measures to address systemic racism. For the first part of our panel discussion, we will have the pleasure to welcome four very distinguished panelists. So I will introduce them. First, I'm going to start with Professor Bina da Costa. She's a member of the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. Ms. da Costa is a professor, Department of International Relations at the Cora Bell School, the Australian National University, ANU, and the Australian Research Council, ARC, Future Fellow. She has published several books and essays, including on war, crimes in South Asia, and children and the politics of violence. She's a member of the international, I want to make sure I pronounce this right, Chulalongkorn. Oh, look at me, A+, sweet, go girl. Hill Tracks Commission, Bangladesh, and was Senior Migration and Displacement Specialist with UNICEF. She's provided technical advice to witness protection and victim support mechanisms in international tribunals and to various civil society justice initiatives in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Cambodia. Thank you for your service. Dr. Oussouby Sacko is Professor of Architecture at the Human Environmental Design Program, Faculty of Design, and the Graduate School of Design Architecture in Kyoto, Seika University. He has served as the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Seika University and President of Kyoto Seika University. He's the Vice President of the Japan Association for World Expo 2025, Director of the Integrated Research Institute of Kyoto Seika University, and Director of the Center of Contemporary African Asian Contemporary Cultural Studies. He has recently conducted a field research in Japan, China, Mali, Morocco, Mauritano historical sites, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Welcome. Mr. Anthony Unor has resided in Thailand for over 2 decades, blending his roles as an educator, community leader, and student, deeply understanding the culture and the experiences of people of African descent in Thailand. He is currently pursuing a Ph.D. in International Development Studies at Chulalongkorn University. He has served as the planning and committee chairman of the Nigeria Diaspora Organization, Thailand chapter. He is currently the vice president of the Nigerian community and the Teachers Union in Thailand. President of the Aqua Cross Association of Nigerians, and the African Volunteers Coordinator to the Associate of Thai-Africa Relations. Mr. Unor research extends beyond Thailand, including studies about climate migrants in Vietnam and Malaysia. Welcome. Mr. Mario Gomez is the Executive Director at the International Center of Ethnic Studies, an independent think tank in Sri Lanka, and an adjunct senior research fellow at the Center for Asian Legal Studies, National University of Singapore. He has worked in academia, human rights, and peace building, and previously taught constitutional law and administrative law at the University of Colombo. Some of his recent publications include topics such as religious violence, national human rights institutions, dealing with the past, the death penalty, and constitutional reform in Sri Lanka. Welcome to you as well. Professor Da Costa, we're going to start with you. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies, distinguished panelists, dear colleagues and friends. I begin today by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, traditional custodians of the land on which I work in Australia, which is Canberra. I pay my respects to elders past and present. As we mark the end of this decade for people of African descent and conclude the conversations with a focus on the issues related to recognition, justice, and development, please allow me to recall the discussions we had in the past 4 meetings about justice. Experts emphasized the importance of access to justice and reparatory justice and measures to address systemic racism. Justice can only be achieved through acknowledging the past legacies of enslavement and in particular the slave trade. In the Durban Declaration, just bear with me for a minute. My apologies. In the Durban Declaration, states have acknowledged that slavery and slave trade are a crime against humanity. That, I quote, "These are among the major sources of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance," quote closed. And that Africans and people of African descent, among others, continue to be victims of those consequences. I wanted to explain a little bit how we're going to talk about Asia Pacific, but having seen so many Australians represented, I feel like I don't need to. But just to explain a little bit, that I'm expanding how we talk about Asia Pacific that include geopolitical, security, and economic connections, and also connections through oceans and migratory routes. In this sense, the region that is home to so many of us is broader, and it includes Greater Asia, the Pacific countries, Australia, and New Zealand. We hoped that the hosting of this regional meeting would create important opportunities and entry points for meaningful engagements with Asia and the Pacific countries for us. Disappointingly, even after very intense advocacy from our part, we were unable to secure an invitation to hold this meeting in the region. Hence, we are meeting in Geneva. For me personally, as a member of Asia Pacific states, this is disheartening. We have missed an important opportunity to engage and learn from each other and highlight the presence, continued relationship, and contribution of people of African descent in the region. This has actually been perplexing because for our region, connection with Africa in terms of trade, security, peacekeeping, development, they receive priority from member states. In this sense, where is our collective and individual commitments to understand people and communities of African descent who live and who belong to the region? Since 2002, the working group has conducted 23 country visits, including 5 follow-up visits at the invitation of the governments and under the terms of references of the special procedures. While the working group was able to go for a country visit to Australia in early 2023, none of the countries of Asia and the Pacific had yet invited the working group for a country visit or responded to a call for information sent out by the working group. Only through data collection would the working group obtain a clearer picture of all the challenges faced by people of African descent in the region. thereby allowing for appropriate solutions to be formulated. In my focus of justice, I'd like to draw attention to our work and also issues of injustices in the region. The first that we have talked about throughout the day is about data gaps and lack of representation and visibility, and the varied intersections of big data and racial justice and injustice. In our 2019 report on countering negative racial stereotypes of people of African descent, we concluded that mapping and analysis of disaggregated data are crucial to inform policy priorities relating to equality and opportunity for people of African descent. I'll give you some examples, and for brevity, I'm just focusing on 4 countries. In the context of Japan, some challenges lies in the methods that the Japanese government uses to conduct its census. Now, in the US and UK, census data does not merely record nationality, but ethnic and racial background as well. This is because nationality is not all equated with ethnicity or race. However, since Japanese population statistics are only based on nationality, the racial diversity among Japanese nationals is left unexplored by the census. Therefore, the statistics reinforces the idea that the category of Japanese refers to a single ethnic group, and that Japan's population only consists of monoracial Japanese people and non-Japanese people. Yet when we consider the actual racial and ethnic makeup of people living in Japan, we quickly realize that the reality is far more complex. Given that demographic statistics mask the racial diverse reality, it leads to the idea that Japan is not really racially diverse. So there's no such thing as racism in the first place. My colleagues have talked about Australia, and we heard that the 2021 census data actually showed that 1.6% of Australians identified as being of African ancestry. We also know from our working group's report that these figures may be under-inclusive given generations of Australians of African descent. The official statistics may not accurately represent the number of people of African descent in Australia because of the avoidance of race as a data variable, a mandatory ground of exclusion from the census. I also want to add that in the 2026 census data from ANU, we have actively advocated from the Australian National University and Australian Bureau of Statistics from 260 submissions have accepted our submission to include ethnicity as a variable, and there would be questions in the 2026 data. However, in general, in Asia-Pacific states, the unwillingness and lack of commitment by some states to collect and disaggregate data based on race and ethnicity is one of the most serious impediments to the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals and achieving those goals and meeting their targets that are required to dismantle the structural and systemic barriers to sustainable development and access to justice for people of African descent in our region. My second point in terms of justice is the denial of the existence of racism in the region. Authors of a recent volume focusing on Africa and India explain that today's racism towards Africans in India is deeply connected to the structural colorism and caste racism. Now, theoretically, race is not central to the ways in which the caste system is structured and the ways it operates. In the early 2000s, for instance, the Indian government objected to the notion that discrimination by caste is the same as racism, which was brought up at the UN Conference Against Racism in Durban. However, people of African descent who live in India have always compared their experiences and the experiences of the cities with the plight of Dalits in contemporary India. They've mentioned that like the Dalits, the sub-Saharan Africans in particular, and the cities, they face discrimination, violence, marginalization, and racism. Media reported hate speech and attacks against sub-Saharan Africans in India. Just for brevity, I'm going to summarize. Between 2013 to 2016, there were murders and attacks on Nigerian nationals in Goa, Chadian nationals in Delhi, a Congolese student in New Delhi, and then a Tanzanian woman who was assaulted and stripped in Bangalore. In 2017, there were 4 African women who were forcibly taken to hospital to give urine tests because of these issues that there were some complaints that they were involved in drug and prostitution racket, which was later on found not true. In 2017, there was a mob that hounded 2 Tanzanian women and 2 Nigerian men following rumors that they had kidnapped a child and eaten him. These exemplify the deep-seated prejudice that many Indians have towards Africans. However, there is a denial of the existence of racism in India and most of South Asia. While it is common to talk about racism in Western countries and global North, people in the region rarely confront their own prejudice and bias. Civil society groups and human rights advocates must step up to address some of these deeper and broader issues of prejudice and racism. Beauty standards across Asia, a fetish for light skin, can be observed in beauty advertising, and popular beauty tips include staying out of the sun so as not to tan. So darker skin is associated with a lot of with poverty and different kinds of prejudice. Colonial rules sharpened these inequalities and created a hierarchy that never challenged white privilege. A student of African descent in Tamil Nadu reported experiencing humiliation and suffering in silence. He reported to a journalist that all he had to do is to walk on the street to be greeted a Kalu. Kalu means black person. A derogatory slur. It's being called Kalu or monkey, being reported many times by African students. Now, following attacks on 5 Nigerian students in 2017, the African head of missions in India, in a joint statement, mentioned that these attacks were xenophobic and racial. They also called for strong condemnation from the highest political level, both nationally and locally, of the governments of India, as well as expediting legal actions against the perpetrators. So this is one example. The other one is, again, going back to Japan. Despite recommendations during UPR sessions to take adequate measures against racial discrimination, the Japanese government mentioned, I quote, that Japan does not recognize that the present situation of Japan is one in which discriminative acts cannot be effectively restrained by the existing legal system, and in which explicit racial discriminative acts which cannot be restrained by measures other than legislation are conducted. Therefore, penalization of these acts is not considered necessary, quote closed. So, although these issues exist, the denial of racism in particular countries, they undermine the reality. So, anecdotal evidence from people of African descent in Asia-Pacific region also show that they are reluctant to report to police because of the perceptions that they wouldn't get justice or be charged instead with other crimes. The third point I want to mention briefly is about racial discrimination and housing crisis. While aggressive policing of black bodies have been discussed, structural racism in residential areas and rental racism when trying to rent residential units is not always talked about. Entrenched discrimination in the housing market with offensive banners are often found outside housing estates, or they are informally distributed in areas where people of African descent live. A host of public and private policies exclude black people from accessing vast majority of urban space, and many times people of African descent are contained in small, overcrowded areas with poor housing services in various countries. Let me give you an example of Malaysia. Recent research has noted that in contemporary Malaysia, the cultural discourse has emerged concerning the presence of African students and immigrants, and there's virulent anti-black racism and violence. In June 2016, Residents in a municipality outside Kuala Lumpur made headlines when they put up a banner encouraging landlords to say no to African people. I have the photographs in my statement, which would be made available. The bright red banner also bore the image of a dark-skinned man with a large yellow X across his face. It read, "Attention, all homeowners and property agents, in accordance with our internal housing law, no Africans shall be permitted to rent premises in this area with immediate effect." This housing law that was referred to on the banner is not actually a law, but rather a set of guidelines created by, in this case, the particular administration of the residential complex. However, because there's no anti-discrimination or anti-racism laws in place in Malaysia, there's no way to regulate these kinds of guidelines. There's also, in another banner, it translated that 0% housing target of Africans, rental housing by 2017. So there's a new tenancy law that's being talked about that's meant to address some of the discrimination, but Malaysian law does not currently prevent landlords from discriminating in this way. Further, no legal provision is made for impacted persons to file complaints. Some of these landlords have also proposed extending this discrimination to the Chinese and Indian communities. My last final point is about immigration policies and injustices in the asylum process. Now, people of African descent, as many of us know, are vastly overrepresented in immigration detention and indefinite detention. Serious human rights violations have been reported by people of African descent in detention facilities and reception centers. In our report on Australia, we talked about excessive use of force and death in custody. And these have been reported by human rights institutions in India as well. Criminalization, hate speech, negative stereotypes are common in terms of talking about people of African descent. These actually also impact protection of asylum seekers, as we know. There are also different kinds of portrayal of youth of African descent as dangerous and criminal. In our report on Australia, we also talked about the African gang narratives that are used to leverage political support. In Japan, immigration policies have long been described by observers as unduly harsh and strict, and the country, as we know, also accepts very few asylum applications. With regard to detention, there had also been some issues in terms of controversial practice of automatically detaining all irregular arrivals for indefinite periods. There's gendered implications of such restrictions, as explained in the case of Elizabeth Obuyeza, who had been in Japan since 1991, and she fled from Nigeria. I'm going to skip the point about artificial intelligence, as many of my colleagues have also mentioned that. But in the statement, I detail the issues of surveillance as well in the criminal justice system and in schools as well. So this snapshot talks about injustices, racism, and discrimination that people of African descent experience in the region. But there are sectors, other sectors, such as education and media. They also play a role play their part in silencing the reality of racial justice in the region. Examples of young South Sudanese Australians, particularly dark-skinned youth of African descent, experiencing severe stigma and racial abuse. Then Congolese students in Delhi fearing for their life, in international and local schools in Malaysia, the Philippines, India, and Japan, where students talked about deep racism in education sector. Children of African descent, they also report experiencing racial slurs, bullying, labeling, stereotyping, and pejorative name-calling from classmates and teachers, as well as actually ostracization and isolation. I have a few recommendations, but I'll just pick up only two for here. One is that member states are encouraged to disaggregate official data by race, including for census data, household surveys, and vital statistics, including by other official statistical collection programs. Civil society organizations, including academic institutions, are encouraged to advocate with their governments to draft anti-discrimination laws and develop targeted advocacy campaigns to promote a culture of pluralism. Thank you.
Professor DaCosta, thank you so much, and thank you for the way that you tied all of that together. So I do appreciate that, and I look forward to the questions that we'll get with that too. Just a quick reminder for folks to keep an eye on your time, so we do leave enough time for the Q&A end point as well. And so, Dr. Sacko, I invite you, sir, please.
Yeah, but it's not important if I can. It's okay. You sure? No problem. Esteemed members of states, representative of the international and regional organizations, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here and talk about my experiences in China and Japan as a member of African diaspora. I would like to make a statement related to African and African descent in Asia. I would like also to acknowledge the historical link between the two continents. Knowing African history is something very important for us. History helps to connect with our past, to have a conversation with our ancestors, and learn about their experiences. Learning about history is very important, but the question was there, that history was written and designed by whom? An eminent Nigerian-born professor, Dr. Toyin Falola, teaches us that African history has been written, spoken by people outside of their reality. Joseph Keesee, the great historian from Burkina Faso, also was mentioning the same. I come from a region, part of Africa, where oral tradition and storytelling are very important. Our history has been told by the group of people named Jelly Griot, and they are keeping it and transmit it from generation to generation even now. So my role here is also to transmit my story in Asia as a member of African diaspora. Today I'm here to tell you my story, my life and integration process, which make me, if I can say so, a global citizen in Asia. What means being an African born living in Asia? What I have learned in 33 years in Japan, 39 years in total in Asia. Asia and Africa, far and near. Asia and Africa are geographically far apart. It was almost 39 years ago when I came to Asia from my home country, Republic of Mali, in West Africa. At the same time, the information available to the average African about Asia was not about individual countries or regions, but only a regional impression of Asia as a whole, or a fragmented knowledge of its history as described in textbooks. In addition to the stereotypes of martial arts, Buddhism, electronics, cars, Buddhism, small people, and many children, they are hardworking and patient. That's what we know about Asia before we go. I myself had assumed that all Asians excelled in martial art, like Bruce Lee in the movies. On the other hand, Asian people must also have had the same vague impression of Africa. Africans are all bushmen, usually wearing a waistcoat and living in trees surrounded by wild animals such as lions and elephants. In recent years, many people of African origin have migrated to Asian countries in search of jobs, knowledge, skills, and business opportunities. The catalyst of this trend was the first Asia-African conference held in Bandung, Indonesia in 1955. At the conference, the need for cooperation between Asia and Africa to form a third pole was pointed out. This was because Asia and Africa share a common history and were therefore aiming in the same direction after World War II. Both shared the experience of colonial rule and were governed under similar colonial policies, and thus share similar feeling after independence. So before colonial rule, Asia was home to a variety of civilizations. The same is true for Africa, where various empires and kingdoms existed for centuries and actively interacted and traced with the outside of the continent. In terms of faith, animism, and nature worship was the bedrock of civilization for many African societies before they were converted to Islam or Christianity, much the same as in Asia. So after Bandung even thought only few countries participated, Asia and Africa would develop economically, socially, and culturally together, overcoming their history and recognizing each other's existence. From then on, the shared goals of the physical far apart and exchanges between their people became more active. Eventually, the relationship between the two continents evolved from mutual assistance to beginning, where more framework-driven have been on a rapid increase in recent years. The number of Africans immigrating to Asia countries and Asians doing business in Africa has also gradually increased. After the independence of many African countries, the cooperation between Asia and Africa, especially between Mali and China, was really fruitful. So I would like very quickly to introduce myself. I was a little confused also how and where to begin my story. Being in other cultures gives you the chance to meet yourself, to know about yourself, to accept yourself, and by doing that, you accept others. This is the secret of diversity and inclusion. I left my country at the age of 19 when I succeeded high school baccalaureate exams and was selected as government student to go to China. Of course, I've heard about China, but without any specific interest. Before heading to China, we got the opportunity to stay a few days in Paris. I was shocked culturally, but also identical, because that was the first time I had to think about the color of my skin, my origin, even my country position in the world. My first year in China was a series of culture shocks. We met people from different countries and races we had never met before, and were exposed to languages and value we had never experienced also before. An exciting year passed in this way. Then, of course, there was the interaction with Chinese. Even though they are also Asian, the expression they're feeling much more stressful than Japanese as well. They are very passionate due to the differences in culture and ways of thinking. So we sometimes argue and sometimes got into fight where our hands also would come out sometimes. Maybe you can imagine Chinese people when we were walking on the street come and touch us and say, oh, the color is really natural. That happens many times, but that was really for them natural. So the more we clash and vent, the less stressful it was for us. But that didn't mean we didn't have a close relationship with them. First, there was a very economical gap between the international students and even African and Chinese students. Lines were clearly drawn, and we were treated differently in dormitory life and even on campus. Chinese students were monitored in their social interaction with foreigners, and I felt that Chinese government had a great deal of control over them at the university. I made connection with other international students and enjoyed deepening exchanges while we were planning various parties. However, this led to some animosity from Chinese students. 6 months before the Tiananmen Square protest, there was a build-up of disaffection among Chinese youth. As a result, riots, a racist demonstration against international students, particularly Africans, so we were the subject in Nanjing about the 1988 reared against Africans. And then we were even take over some places we don't know. I mean, for a week. They say that maybe it's for our protections, but only God knows what happened to us. So life as African in Japan and integration issues. After my bachelor degree in architecture and after attending master classes in China, I decided to pursue my studies in Japan. I went to Japan in 1991, and since I live there and work in Kyoto. When I first arrived in Japan, I was struggling with the human relationship. They are unique to Japan. I have deepened my involvement and understanding of Japan. As a young African, I soon become engaged in activities to deepen the understanding of the international community. I mastered very early to speak Japanese, which gives me more chance to integrate to society and having even more objective views about it. My goal was to rediscover myself by meeting others. I was trying hard to integrate Japanese society and culture within being assimilated. I was avoiding cultural assimilation. Japanese perception of others, as you may know, is as package. According to cultural sigma theory, humans store their experiences in long-term memory, which is organized as knowledge and act based on it. That means if Japanese people meet you, they see you only with the experience, with the knowledge they have, but they don't see you in front of them. And that's also what happened to me. I introduced myself always as a Malian native from Africa, and many Japanese were saying, "Oh, I'm so happy to meet you because I love animals." So for me, diversity refers to differences that exist among individuals, such as race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic background, and ethnicity, and also something you can't change, just the conscious about it. So as an educator and architect, I try to change the social approach of my students, how to perceive without framing them. When I was elected president of Kyoto Seika University in 2018, the first thing I did is to make the declaration on diversity, to change the consciousness of what we call the majority. I changed even the frame of the entrance examination to give equal chance to everyone who wanted and can challenge my university exam. A lot of newspapers, foreign and Japanese media, TV as well, from all over the world came to interview me. One of the large newspaper was an American newspaper, if I can say here, the New York Times, and the title was, "In Homogeneous Japan, an African-born university president on a mission." Japan has a very low rate of having foreigners or foreign background in managerial position. And all news were tending to make me a special or single isolated case. I have telling them I was that boy on the street of Bamako, playing soccer, hanging with my friends. But the problem was we were not always giving the equal chance as kids in the West. So somehow, what I understood is being African, Black, and Muslim was a kind of handicap for being successful in Asia. I try to support younger Africans in the diaspora opportunity to know themselves, to meet themselves through other culture, to use others as mirror, and finally to accept themselves. If you understand yourself, you can understand others, as I was saying. And then also, you can be more inclusive. You can even support others to meet themselves. That the dialogue with myself was very important for me to live and survive in one of the most homogeneous society in the world. So how to keep your cultural identity? How I do manage to others accept me, myself in Japan. So, of course, it was very hard for me even to raise my two boys in that environment. So the journalists, especially from foreign newspapers, were keeping asking me about racism, discrimination in Japan. As my colleagues say, sometimes racism is very difficult to explain in Japan, especially structured racism. I was believing that my case was not a structured, sometimes racism, that I have the duty to make people understand who am I, who they are, and accept themselves as I did. So that's why I was organizing cultural meetings between African and Japanese Once they have experienced other culture out of their comfort zone, Japanese or African almost change, and sometimes even dramatically, metamorphosis. And because something different happened to them while building inside their own identity. The model of spending time in one culture and society from birth to death is being shaken by globalization. People, goods, and systems from all nations are overflowing in our lives, learning and work, and it is no longer possible to stick to the common sense of your own culture or your own country. And the number of people around the world who have lost and collapsed their core identity is increasing. As a Malian who visited various countries and lived outside of African continent for a long time, I was forced to understand the importance of cultural identity and the meaning of its representation. As we live outside of Africa, we are constantly questioned about our own identification, the differences and perception between others and ourselves, and between multiculturalism and our own culture. Therefore, we always seek cultural identity and its representations. So I think globalization also is giving us a chance to show to others who we are. So about African living in Japan. So the number of African immigrants in Japan is said to have increased from the late 80s to the 90s. Many of them did not come directly from Africa to Japan, but first lived in the Maghreb, or in the Middle East, or in other Asian countries, and then came to Japan when they had the opportunity. Africans who moved to Japan in search of work relied on their own network, or they work on construction sites, factories, and restaurants. Since they formed community and lived according to their own religion, languages, and ethnic groups, not a few of them did not learn Japanese and did not even have much contact with Japanese culture and society. So that was the big problem we had. Even from my perspective as someone who studied at a Japanese graduate school and now teaches in Japanese university, I felt very strange about the relationship between African and Japanese. When I came to Japan in '91, I was told, "You have a good eyesight, don't you?" I say, "Why?" "Because you can see lions from 10 kilometers. So, I mean, that was the stereotype of Japanese, like understanding us, not including us, but treating us with all this idea they have, actually. So many young Africans are very interested now in Japan. For many Africans, Japanese society remains a fictional and dream country. As mentioned earlier, most of their admiration as depicted in manga and anime, as was like the young African before. And at this time, thanks to the professional development training and adult master programs, the number of people of African origin was apparently increasing in Japan. And then also finally, in 2000s, the number of Africans studying in Japan out of their own interests beyond assignment or destination by the government and companies has gradually increased. They're also proud of their own culture and aware they need to build a bridge between Japan and Africa. They began to set up organizations for culture and academic exchange and actively organize cultures tours to Africa and Africa-related workshops. So in addition to these events, business and cultural circles have also increased, based also in restaurants running by Africans and also stores, selling Africans food and goods. Africans and African descent living in Japan are working hard as cultural facilitators to bridge the gap between the mutual images of Africa and Japan. Several groups were built. I can say like the Association of Africans in Kyoto, African Diaspora Network in Japan, and also Africa Meets Kansai, and so on. So at the end, if you're interested, I will put in my statement, the African Diaspora Network is a new network. I'm also involved. And then we are trying to make a link and also to change this image and also to be very informative to Japanese society. As also the recommendation, I think a dialogue between the African continent and its diaspora also is necessary. Because, of course, even if they don't think so, we are the ambassador of African countries in our host countries. So it's very important to have that kind of dialogue and also to seek how to change the image of Africa. I think that will not happen without us. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Sacko, for your story and sharing your story, because that's not easy either. So I do appreciate that and your perspective. Inviting Mr. Anthony Unor to the floor, please, sir. And just a reminder to the rest of the folks, about 15 minutes piece, and I want to make sure that we have time for questions. Thank you, sir. Go ahead.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, once again. I have obviously been introduced, so there's no need for that. I just go into my presentation. I'm presenting a topic entitled Voices Unheard, Nigerian Migrants in Thailand, Unveiling Experiences of Racism and Racial Discrimination as Development Challenges. My name again is Anthony Unor. I am a student of Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. I'm currently studying Ph.D. in International Development Studies, and I've been in Thailand for over 2 decades. So that's enough for me to actually have enough interaction with Thai people. So for the overview of my presentation, I'll give you a brief historical context of Black Africans' contribution to the region and the origin of discrimination from a contemporary point of view. And we look at the disturbing pattern of discriminations identified among the participants in the research. And again, I just want to establish from the onset that this is actually part of my PhD studies, and that's why I'm not, projecting it for some reasons. It's an ongoing study, so okay. And we will look at race the challenges from intersectionality point of view. We also discovered systemic oppression I will talk about the economic impacts on the migrants in Bangkok as well. The objective is actually to investigate Nigerian migrants' experience, as I have said, and then we explore migrants' coping strategies, some of the strategies the migrants employ in their effort to overcome some of these challenges, looking at their agency and resilience. And then we examine the effect on African migrants' integration in Thailand. Well, as I have said earlier, it's a study, so we adopted a sampling. Snowballing sampling was actually used, and then the data collection took the form of semi-structured interview, observation, and focus group discussions among the participants. We actually had 4 focal groups discussions with the participants at different levels, at the beginning, the middle, to compare some of the data we collected from the field. And then narrative analysis was actually used to analyze the data. But again, when we talk about African migrants, the question that always comes to mind, particularly when dealing with the Thai audience, is why are you even talking about them? And I think it's important for us to actually establish that why most parts of the world are already going yellow or red, if you like, Africa is green. It means that the future of the world depends on Africa. In the context of Nigeria, for instance, Nigeria holds a median age of 18%, which is pretty young. And that's to say over 50% of Nigerians are young, below the age of 19. So that is the potential for migration, particularly with the increasing aging population challenges in Southeast Asia, which Thailand was also, is currently affected. And that's why talking about migrants from Africa is quite important, particularly in the context of Southeast Asia. I'd like to also establish that this study was not actually conducted without personal experience, as a kind of motivation. I went into the studies because of my personal experience back from home, having come from a minority group in Nigeria, where you have to struggle with permanent marginality, and then coming to Thailand, you still have to face the same issues. And that opened my mind to actually feel like, well, I think I have to confront this issue rather than sitting on the bench. So, and to actually capture the everyday life racism we deal with in Bangkok, I actually have to quote one of the statement from one of my participants who says, this thing called racism or discrimination is always there. And everywhere you go, there is no hiding place for us as Black Africans. I think that the only time that I feel free from the monster is when you shut your door behind you at home and you are alone, not even with your Thai wife or girlfriend. It surprised me that despite being very hospitable destination, nobody seems to care about how this thing affects every aspect of our lives in Thailand. Not even our embassies cares. So it gives you an idea of the everyday challenges Africans have to face in dealing with particularly this person told me horrible experience about how he had to abandon his wife as a result of racism because she sent him to go buy something at 7-Eleven. When he came back, she was just talking to him as if he's like, and then he said, look, at this point I can't take it anymore, so the relationship just ended that day. So really very sad. And as per the historical context, I look at the interaction of Africans in Southeast Asia, contemporary interaction actually, beside the slave trade, the transatlantic trade, to the Second World War, when over 90,000 Africans were conscripted to fight in the jungles of Burma between Kanchanaburi in Thailand and Myanmar, current Myanmar. And out of this population, 45,000 Nigerians actually fought directly in that place. A lot of them died. And I just keep remembering the story of one man, Oussouby. When I was about 5 years to 7 years old, he happened to fight in this war. So when he came back then, he used to sit us down and tell us the horrors of the war, how humans were used as biscuits on the red line, and how he literally survived through God's mercy because he never believed he could make it. But what happened at the end of the war, they were never recognized. Nothing was mentioned about them, neither by the British government nor the region itself until today. So the sense of denialism continues until today when it comes to dealing with Africans. And then the next phase, more contemporary, was between 1964 and 1975, when over 300,000 Black Americans served in the American-Vietnamese War. Yet then, despite the disproportionate number of Blacks who were recruited into the war, about 12% of them, 12% of them constitute the entire population of soldiers who fought there, just to give an idea, despite being minorities in America. And then the Black servicemen were about 16% of the armed forces, and up to 25% of them were men, Black African men, and only 2% were officials out of the whole population. And a lot of them were exposed to so many kinds of treatments. And at the end, it resulted to drug, just to deal with the horrors of war. And what happened? Drug trafficking, addiction, and then trafficking. That actually was the foundation of the idea of Black being stereotyped for their involvement in drugs. Until tomorrow in Thailand, you walk on the street and people see you, what they ask you is, do you have, and they have different names they call them. Okay, so when you're looking for a job, nobody gives you a job. But then the next thing they ask you on the street is, do you have something? And this is how they actually created the underground economy for Black Africans to be involved in drug trafficking in Bangkok, because the mainstream economy doesn't welcome them, so you gradually push them. As a person, I've been approached so many times to supply drugs to them. I say, do I look like one? And they say, it doesn't matter, you're just a Black man. So, these are realities. These are the issues we deal with every day. And then the most recent arrival of mainstream Black African migrants in Thailand actually takes place in 1980, and it was not because of the post-independence struggle in Africa, economic hardship and the rest of them, coupled with globalization, advancement in technology, job opportunities. And again, remember in 1980 was when Asia emerged as the Asian tigers emerged, and that opened up. And Thailand was also transiting from agriculture into manufacturing. So that created a lot of jobs, and Africans were also, coupled with improved diplomatic ties, the South-South movement, collaboration, opened the doors, and Africans started coming to Asia for the first time in their large number. Ordinarily, we all know that African traditional migration route is the West, Europe and America, but that changed in the 1980s because of those, the dynamics of 1980s. Okay, but then in the case of Nigerians, the first people who actually came to Thailand were traders, and then followed by students later on, and that was when the Japa syndrome catch up with most of them. The Japa syndrome catch up with most of them, which is basically people migrating for greener pasture. Okay, but despite Africans' contribution, African migration has often been conceptualized as being forced migration. Of course, that's what happened when it comes to categorization. Anything in Africa is often the other way around, but when white folks, for instance, come to Africa, we call them expats. But Africans are never seen as expats. We are called migrants. So I think there's a problem with conceptualization and categorizations. We really need to rethink about some of the ways we actually categorize these terms so that we can actually help to address some of the issues. And, well, to actually understand how racism functions in Thailand, we use the concept of ordering. And it wasn't actually easy because we have to actually debate the meaning of ordering with the local people for kind of acceptance in terms of definition. So we eventually define ordering in Thailand concept, for instance, as, sorry. Okay, I just skipped that. Okay, so for disturbing pattern of discriminations in Bangkok, I will also want to paint a vivid picture of how disturbing it is by quoting one of my Thai participants who said, Tony, don't worry, I've known this person for 20 years, so eventually happened to sit down with her after like 5 times of trying to reach out to her. And she said, Tony, don't worry yourself about this problem because whatever you do, even if you kill yourself, most Thai people will never accept you because you are black. We generally don't like black people, even though that is gradually changing now. We don't like to talk about it because you don't want to lose face. Like, they don't want to talk about it because they don't want to lose face to start with. And she said, please don't be angry with me, nah? I can tell you, I can tell you, Mark, that's me, I really feel for you because you don't understand that Thai people don't like you because you are black. Put it simple. Okay, so talking of how this perpetuate a kind of racism against Nigeria, ordering in the context of Thailand functions by keeping Africa, or anything in Africa, invisible and inaudible. Invisible and inaudible. And we have huge experience based on people's narrative. For instance, Africans are rejected accommodation, which is one of the reasons why I also missed my flight. I had that conversation with some of them in the morning. The social space is not allowed for Africans. It's okay for others, but not for Africans. Policy-wise, Africans remain invisible. And this happened, for instance, in terms of 90 days notification. Other minorities or other migrants are allowed to do it online because the data can be captured easily, but Africans are allowed to do it manually. You have to go there so that it wouldn't show, So there's so many ways these things are perpetrated. During census, Africans are not captured. When they're conducting census and they come to your house and they see you're an African, they say, maybe they just pass you and go their way. So you're not captured because we know data is power. So in the absence of data, it means you are not known, and then you don't have a voice. So we also have housing discrimination. Africans are often pushed to the periphery. There are some areas, for instance, like Pratunam, where Africans were the first people who actually found that market. But when the place began to catch up, Africans were pushed out of the place. Today, you go to Pratunam, you find quite a few shops belonging to Africans. In Sukhumvit area, once known for, popular for African businesses, there's no single one there now, currently. No. They push out of the areas. So the more the places develop, the more they come up with policies and kind of practices, particularly harassment and indiscriminate crackdown on people visiting their shops. And with time, if there is no sales, they just have to relocate. They keep moving, you know. So there's no future for them. And there's also lack of recognition for African talent or work. No matter what you do, currently I'm pushing Ph.D., but when I show up to look for a job, they just told me, look, we can't even take your master's. We can only accept you with bachelor degree. Yeah, so that's the way we just keep you invisible so that you're not known, because there's no, and of course, I've taught for 20 years, but I remain a teacher. The same way I've been teaching 20 years is when in fact, I was teaching secondary school, but currently, when I quit the job because I went home to apply for visa, stayed for 2 months because of the same difficulties, you know. By the time I came back, I lost my job. So when I went for a new job, I was offered to teach a primary school. So yeah, these are the realities we face in Thailand. So medical treatment, people face it. A lady told us she lost her womb when she went to the hospital. She never consented to it. She just realized 3 years later that her womb was no longer there. And she went to the hospital, nobody said anything about it. And other people complain about how they went to the hospitals and were not given proper treatment, even though they have health insurance. I know of a lady who almost died in the hospital, and the doctor, one of the doctors who work in the hospital, called me and said, Tony, please tell the lady to go and get herself better treatment elsewhere. Otherwise, she would die because nobody would talk to her. So she was flown, I think they flew her home some 8 months ago. She got home to amazement in Cameroon. She got well in just less than 3 weeks, despite spending up to 3 months in the hospital in Thailand. And then she came back again. So these are realities. And it's so sad that no matter what happened to our people, you can't just go back and stay because things aren't getting better in Africa. And that's something that I think young generation, like some of us who are actually speaking out, must also look into so that we don't just fight here, we also have to take this voice home and hold the African Union accountable, for instance, so that our leaders can actually help to improve the situation in Africa. Because until we do that, Africans cannot be recognized outside Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Unor. We need just an hour for you, and we all understand how to hold on to your research, okay? So you make sure you do that. All right, I'm going to invite you, sir. Mr. Gomez, please.
Thank you very much. I know I'm the last speaker this afternoon, so I'll be brief. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, yeah, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here at what is, I think, a very important event. I thought in my presentation this afternoon, I will use the Sri Lankan experience with discrimination and inequality to perhaps throw 3 or 4 ideas into the pot as we move into a second decade to celebrate people of African origin and descent and to acknowledge their struggles. So Sri Lanka was previously known for its rich social diversity and a previous history of coexistence among its different ethnic and religious groups. Located at the intersection of major trade routes along the Indian Ocean, including the Silk Route, Sri Lanka has been a land of many migrations, as reflected in the island's diverse ethnic and socio-cultural fabric. Among those migrations was the migration of people from Africa. These Afro-Sri Lankans, or Sri Lankan Africans, as some of them have recently begun to call themselves, were brought by the colonial Portuguese, the Dutch, and by private traders to work as slaves, mercenaries, and to serve in a variety of other occupations. Their traditions and culture have shaped the heritage of modern Sri Lanka. Africans were also brought by the British to be trained as soldiers, and some of them fought in the British Army in World War II. There are contesting accounts by historians on the numbers who were brought by the Portuguese, the Dutch, and by private traders, but at least one thing they do agree on is that people of African descent did indeed come to Sri Lanka. Afro-Sri Lankans have been commonly referred to as Kaffers, although the term in Sri Lanka does not bear the negative image it bears in some parts of Africa. Their numbers have reduced over the years, as many of them have assimilated into other ethnic groups. The Portuguese Creole they spoke is no longer spoken widely. Some academic research suggests that the socioeconomic conditions of the group remain poor, with very poor access to education, healthcare, and social protection. Historian Wickramasinghe argues that slavery in Sri Lanka at one time was widespread, and slaves were not only of African origin, but also came from South and Southeast Asia. Slavery was abolished by the British around the mid-19th century. Till about 1911, Afro-Sri Lankans were documented in the national census. In recent years, however, because of diminishing numbers, they have not been identified as a separate ethnic group. Afro-Sri Lankans have been marginalized and have not received the academic attention they should have received. Shihan de Silva Jayasuriya is one of the few academics who has written extensively on the Afro-Sri Lankans, and I believe she will be joining the meeting tomorrow morning. In recent years, there's been an increasing interest in the music, the dance, and the lifestyle of Afro-Sri Lankans. And at the International Center for Ethnic Studies, the institution at which I work in Sri Lanka, we have been able to host a few events showcasing their culture and some academic lectures as well. Their dance styles include the kafringa and the manya, and the contemporary popular music baila. Baila is the most popular form of music in Sri Lanka and has its roots in African, Portuguese, and Sinhala music. Now, ethnic and religious diversity and the mix of identities is not unique to Sri Lanka. Many countries, including all countries in South Asia, are plural, diverse, and complex. However, Sri Lanka's size and its cultural, geographical, and social diversity puts it in a different league, leading Marco Polo to comment that it was undoubtedly the finest island of its size in the world. Now, even though Sri Lanka has been a site of diversity, confluence, and migration for centuries, modern Sri Lanka has struggled to manage ethnic and religious diversity and relations. Ethnicity, religion, caste, and class have been mobilized as points of entry for competitive politics. Rather than celebrate coexistence and diversity, political leaders have sown animosity and anxiety, leading to several bouts of intergroup violence and animosity and the rupturing of social relations. Celebrating diversity has been a challenge, and religion and language have been used as dividers, not connectors. The curtailment of citizenship and voting rights has been one way in which the state has discriminated against ethnic minorities. The country received independence in 1948, and within a few years, several 100,000 Indian Tamils had their citizenship rights and voting rights removed through law. Last year marked 200 years since the arrival of indentured Indian labor, who first worked the coffee and then the tea plantations. They have been an integral part of the country since then and a key player in the economy. However, they have also had to endure near slave-like conditions. The women from the Indian Tamils or Malayaha Tamils are those that pick the two leaves and a bud that end up as nicely packaged Ceylon tea in your living rooms. For many years, the export of tea was one of the country's main exports, and those that drove this industry were mainly women, often working in precarious conditions. Yet the Indian Tamils or upcountry Tamils, also identified as Malaya Tamils, have been among the most disadvantaged population groups in the country and had historically had poor access to education, healthcare, and social protection. Many of them remain stateless and without voting rights for over 40 years. Language has also been another tool of discrimination. Where language should have been used to connect people, it has instead been used to divide ethnic groups. Sri Lanka uses 3 main languages: Sinhala, Tamil, and English. In the 1950s, the state passed a law privileging the Sinhala language and making it imperative that those in the public service acquire proficiency in Sinhala. It took many years for this policy to be reversed, and Tamil is now constitutionally recognized as an official language. The laws on citizenship, voting, and language rights were challenged in the courts, but the courts declined to intervene on several technical grounds. This was despite a provision in the Constitution that guaranteed equality to all social groups. The importance of having effective laws in legal institutions has been highlighted in all UN treaties and documents on human rights. And effective legal institutions are important not only for people of African descent, but also to protect the rights of all ethnic minorities. I'm raising here the question of law and legal institutions because I think the Sri Lankan experience highlights the value of having effective legal institutions accompanied by effective legal interpretation. And so may I suggest that as we enter a second decade on celebrating the lives of people of African descent, we look a little more closely at judges and legal interpretation. And may I suggest humbly that member states, OHCHR, civil society, and academia consider engaging a little more with judges so as to develop creative interpretations around equality and discrimination, especially in terms of equality of outcome. I'm currently involved in a project with the National University of Singapore on social cohesion and judges. And we're talking to Asian judges to see at all whether social cohesion plays an important role when they decide cases. So this is one recommendation as we move forward. The other thing I want to talk about is shared cultural and religious spaces. Both the General Assembly resolution and the Durban Declaration and Program of Action speak of the need to spread awareness on ethnic and religious minorities and the need to spread awareness about their culture and heritage. One of the things the International Center for Ethnic Studies, where I work, has been doing is to showcase hidden narratives and highlight histories about groups that often do not get told. So for example, one of our recent documentaries explored the world of Islam and music and some of the tensions that exist in the Islamic world around dance and music. 2 other documentaries explored the subject of mass grave sites and the impunity that these sites give rise to. A related activity has been to showcase stories of cultural confluence and shared spaces. Even though Sri Lanka has had to deal with ethnic and religious conflict for many years, there are plenty of stories of shared spaces and stories of collaboration across different ethnic groups. There are dozens of monuments and heritage sites in the country that have been inspired by different cultures. For example, Adams Peak, a well-known mountain in central Sri Lanka, is sacred to at least 3 different ethnic groups. In the south of the country, members from all ethnic groups take their requests to the gods that reside in the temple in the south. There are also interesting examples from early Sri Lankan cinema where people of different ethnic groups have collaborated across their social identity, whether as actors, musicians, film directors, or producers. So at my institution, we've used semi-academic articles, photos, and documentaries to showcase both invisible histories and stories of cultural confluence. I think documenting and disseminating credible accounts of their histories, life stories, and struggles provide a counterpoint to the stories of division and hatred, and can lead to a critical reflection and appreciation of different cultures and histories. These activities provide a way of recognition for these groups by credibly documenting their histories, life stories, and struggles, and points of confluence with other groups. And this is something that can be pursued with all groups, including those of African descent. The other point I want to raise, which has come up this morning and also earlier on this afternoon, is the need to document plural and alternative histories. Both the General Assembly resolution and the Durban Declaration highlight the need for social inclusion. And I think social inclusion would mean that the multiple histories of these various groups are documented and archived. At my institution in Sri Lanka, we have recently been engaging with school and university teachers on the teaching of plural and inclusive histories. This would require that the history curriculum taught in schools and universities are revised to take account of the histories of all groups and communities, including those of African descent. History education should also entail learning about the histories of our immediate neighbors and how the culture and heritage of our neighbors have influenced our own society. This is important for the Asia-Pacific region, and I'm sure for Africa as well. It is not only people who migrated, but heritage and cultures also migrated across the Asia-Pacific region. Public museums, monuments, and other public spaces, including online sites, should document the multiple histories of all social groups. Inspirational narratives about marginalized groups can help break stereotypes and present an interesting portfolio of alternative histories. Finally, the question about dealing with your dark past. I think many countries have struggled to deal with their dark past. Sri Lanka is no exception. Sri Lanka's struggle includes addressing impunity, engaging in truth-seeking, providing reparations, facilitating memorialization, pursuing accountability, and implementing constitutional reform. The ethnic war between the Tamil insurgents and the state ended in 2009 with a military victory for the state. 20 years before that, the state violently crushed another insurgency, this time led by leftist groups. In both cases, there's been no attempt to understand the causes of the violence, to respond to these causes, and to engage in wide-ranging constitutional and institutional reform that these conflicts require. Apart from Tamils, other minorities have also had to contend with violence and no justice. Muslims have been at the receiving end of violence since the 1970s, and violence against the Muslims escalated after 2009 and increased in intensity after the Easter bombings of 2019. As I mentioned, upcountry or Malayaha Tamils, descendants of labor brought by the British colonial regime to work the tea plantations, have faced marginalization, exclusion, and discrimination for generations, including the loss of citizenship rights. Evangelical Christians have also been at the receiving end of violence, with their places of worship being vandalized and their pastors physically attacked. So to summarize then, I've tried to raise 3 to 4 issues which I want to put on the table both for member states, for HCHR, civil society, and academia. The first is the question of legal institutions, and I would urge perhaps some engagement with judges so as to try and develop and facilitate legal interpretations that are progressive around equality and discrimination. The second is to try and generate stories of shared spaces and cultural confluence, and to show that despite conflict and divisions and hatred, there are moments when groups come together across ethnicity, across race, and across other dividers. And so let's complicate the discourse a little bit by also showcasing and highlighting some of these shared spaces. Thirdly, the idea of generating plural, alternative, inclusive histories of all social groups, and ensuring that these groups get into mainstream history curriculum, but also beyond that, to use the arts, to use film, to use theater and the other art forms to generate histories that are engaging and inclusive. And here I talk also about visits to sites of cultural heritage, which should be included as part of the way we teach history. And finally, the challenge of dealing with our dark past in the global south. Many of our countries have experienced overt violence. Others have experienced structural violence and discrimination. How do we deal with the challenges of accountability, impunity, reparations, memorialization, and of course, truth-telling? So may I just drop those ideas into the pot? And thank you once again for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, and we'll take those into the pot. And so I want to just take a few minutes. I'm looking at time, but I also want to be respectful of this panel who've given all of their comments, and I thank you for that as well. I now invite the delegates, participating states of Asia and Pacific, to pose any questions you may have. And we'll take a look. I know we are the only thing between you and happy hour, and we're going to get a question. So that's how I operate. Now, there it is. Well, hang on. Let me make sure I don't have any member states. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all the experts for sharing your experience. I have a question for Professor Sacko. Thank you for sharing your experience in China and in Japan. Although I found the case you mentioned, the fight in Nanjing in 1980s, I myself was born in Nanjing, and I'm a student graduated from the University of Nanjing. Because from my perspective, I think the universities in Nanjing welcome the African students, and they conquered the budget difficulties to provide scholarships for African students. So maybe it's a little bit hard for me to imagine the kind of fight you mentioned. So may I ask, have you ever been to Nanjing since then? Because I think maybe that's an individual case, yes.
Thank you very much for your question. Yes, I have been to Nanjing many times after that. And then for your communication, my kids were raised in China. So between the 2000 and 2010. So maybe you may take it as a single case, but you have to imagine that's in the 80s. I was in China between 86 and 91. I don't know when you were born, but you know, it's early time. So there were like two questions. Maybe one thing is the miscommunication. Maybe they didn't have like, the proper information about Africa, because they were keep telling us that, you know, they are providing us food, they are providing us clothes, and they are providing everything, and then why we are like acting as hero. That was the problem. Like, it's a kind of communication problem. It's a kind of information problem. And then maybe you see also, or think about the political situation at that time. So I was like sometimes confused if this was really against us or against a system. Because at the end, I continued my study in China after that. And I went to the master in Nanjing, in Nankong. So I didn't have any problem after that. So that was a short period. Maybe, I don't know if it's a single case, but it happened. That's the most important. It happened. So we don't, if it's a historical fact, it's not an actual fact. That doesn't influence anything, but it happened and we have to recognize it. That's what I mentioned about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sacko. And I think what you said makes sense. And I believe that every country, every city has good guys and bad guys. And I can assure you that they are not targeting at certain specific communities, specific race. They are not targeting at African and African descents. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I got two. So let me, member states first, please. Member states, hold up your tags. So I got member states, because I got a lot of folks who want to jump in. So I'm going to go Elizabeth back here, up here, and then over to your left. And I'll do it again so you can make sure. So.
Thank you. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on the issue of lateral violence. Now, aside from policy changes, how else do we achieve racial justice, particularly recognizing anti-Black racism, which we know is very distinct from racism experienced by people of color more generally? Now, my question is kind of addressed generically, but I am particularly interested in hearing your thoughts, Professor Da Costa, and also if I can add you, Dr. Tracie, into the mix, in the context of Australia and the US as settler colonial states. Thank you.
For the sake of time, I'm going to take myself out of the mix. We can have a side conversation. No, Dr. Costa, please. Yeah, let's see what the other ones are too, because they might be a little long and we're going to have to go. So thank you for that. And then I have up front and then the back. Did I do that right? And then all the way to my left.
For me, my question is not directed to the panel, but is directed to China, because he questioned Professor Sacko about when was the last time he was in Nanjing. But if I may ask, when was the last time he had anything to do with people of African descent? Because I'm based in China for 16 years. Even up until now, I've even got a case, personal case that happened last week. So are you informed about what is happening to people of African descent in your country? Because we can try and talk about a specific case and things like that, but I just want to know, as a person who's contributing to the economy of China, do you understand the problems that we are facing in China? This is my question for you.
Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
This is to Professor Costa. I'm Dr. Sivapragasam from Sri Lanka. While agreeing your presentation on the discrimination against African descent in Malaysia, so my question is, yes, of course, there's a discrimination, and I agree that. Within this discrimination also, I see, as far as to my readings and learnings, I see that there is disparities or the degree of discrimination between Muslim African and non-Muslim African. Even the Malaysia is, as a Muslim country, they are following the Islamic way, and the Bhumi Putra. Discrimination is there, but between Muslim African and non-Muslim African, there is a big difference and disparities. So it should be taken into consideration, because the non-Muslim Africans are facing more discrimination in Malaysia, as far as to my learnings. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have one more before we start answering in the corner. We had one more? Yes.
Well, thank you, Chairperson. My question is in the form of a remark, actually, but I'll direct you to Professor Sacko from Kyoto and Anthony Unor, the Ph.D. student. Thank you for your presentation, because that really touched me, you know, as someone who's lived in Thailand and in Japan. And how can we, you know, as a people, you know, make states in the region, especially in Thailand and Japan, to prioritize issues of people of African descent? Because from a personal point of view, and also from research, states in the Asia-Pacific region are not really interested in this issue. It's not a priority at all. And just a bit of a remark, if I may, you know, issues of racism, racial profiling, and blatant discrimination in the Asia-Pacific region against people of African descent are real. And we feel it every single day, even though we might not want to talk about it, you know, because we all know sometimes of the consequences. I remember, and I'll say it here, Sam Okere was cancelled almost in South Korea because he talked about, you know, discrimination against people of African descent. And I remember, you know, in Japan, basically, you know, which is sometimes presented as a culturally and ethnically homogeneous society, which in its sense excludes, you know, those who are Gaijin or those who are Kokujin, black people. You know, so that sense of Japanese identity in itself can be used as a culture of exclusion. And I'm going to give you an example. When I was working as a transnational cultural officer for Enabe City Board of Education, there was this kid at school, a nine-year-old, you know, Cameroonian Japanese kid, who came crying to me And when I asked her what's going on, she said that her friends were calling her Kukujin, Kukujin, which means a black person. But remember, she is Japanese, pure, total Japanese, even though she's known as Hafu in Japan, which basically means an ethnically half Japanese, but she was born in Japan and raised in Japan and speaks Japanese, and she's never been to Africa. And when her mates came over asking her, but why are you crying? She shouted, she screamed, Nihonjin desu, which means, I am Japanese, I am Japanese. I would have to tell you, I mean, this is a second generation person of African descent who is a Japanese at that stage. And I also remember Professor Ambassador Sono Nishida, who is Japan's former ambassador to Canada and the United Nations. He, in one of his courses at Hiroshima University, was pretty clear about it. He told us that, remember, Japan is, he gave us an analogy. Japan is like a hotel for foreigners. You got to check in. But remember that the concierge is always looking. When are you going to check out? Because you will check out. So these are the issues that, you know, we face within an advanced country, you know, such as Japan. Well, you know, in Thailand, basically, Thailand is an amazing country. So is Japan. Please do not get me wrong. But these issues must be talked about. For example, the restrictive immigration policies in Thailand has caused a lot of people of African descent and African immigrants to move out of Thailand to Canada, Australia, and America. A friend of mine, when I was doing our Canada research in...
Sir, I'm gonna have to stop you just for a sec.
Okay, I'll just wrap up.
Okay, you're gonna have to wrap up for us.
Yeah, I'll just wrap up.
Thank you.
Yeah, he's been in Thailand for 15 years. 15 years, he's got a Thai wife with 2 Thai kids. But every single year, he has to renew his visa and the immigration every single year, and he has to report to immigration every 90 days. He must go to immigration every 90 days, you know? So there is no path for permanent residency. He finally had to move to Canada because he said, I cannot sustain this blatant discrimination anymore. So how can we prioritize, you know, states in the region to really, you know, look at this issue of the suffering, the cries of people of African descent who have contributed, who are culturally Afro-Asians, and who some are also legally citizens of these countries? Thank you.
Thank you, and all powerful questions. I'm looking at time because we have a time constraint here. Tomorrow morning, I know I'm moderating in the morning as well. Can we just carve out a few minutes to do some of these questions to make sure we give them justice? Does everybody have the question? Do you have your question? I'm looking at you.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
No.
Okay, yeah.
But I do want to do one if I could.
Okay.
So really quickly, you guys, because we really have to get out of here.
Okay.
So if we want to just roll down. Tony, you got yours too? You got your question? Okay. All right.
Okay, I will go very quickly. Thank you very much for the information about China. So delegates, I did. If you can go through internet, I wrote a paper about African immigrants in Guangzhou. So maybe you can see, so it means, there are problems. So I will not go through, but it's a structural problem. It's a kind of China change, regulations every year. Even if you have a visa today, next year you go, they say the visa system changed. And then you can't continue your business. They even order to a newborn baby to go back home and check and have a visa. A newborn baby, 1 week. They say the parents can stay, but the baby should go. That's to give you that idea. They are everywhere. So as you say also, I can respond quickly about Japan and even about Thailand. So I was telling him, when I take my delegation to Thailand as president of the university, so the Thailand university president jumped to me and go to my Japanese colleagues and they want to give card. They say, no, this is the president. They say, why? And then it happened. They arrest me a lot of times at the airport with Japanese passport in Asia, in Thailand, because they don't believe that I can be Japanese anyway. So I think it's very important to raise the voice. I think that's the only way. So it's difficult because Japanese, as someone says, the rules are okay. The rules doesn't mention any discrimination, but in the practice, we have a lot of discrimination. So that means like we have to raise, a lot of voices, on each cases. So that's the only way we can overcome this, what I say, institutional racism. Thank you.
I'd be happy to explain further tomorrow, but in terms of both of the questions that were directed to me, sometimes intersectionality could work, and sometimes we have to actually question what we mean by intersectionality. In terms of Malaysia, obviously faith plays a role, but for us to actually go deeper into the questions of Muslims or non-Muslim Malaysians and the way they are treated, we have to, from the working group, we'd have to have a proper country visit or have access to data or evidence to actually draw attention to some of those kinds of nuances. In terms of Australia, obviously, intersectionality had been used in different ways. So culturally and linguistic diverse people, that's how the government have been talking about some of these issues. But we also know that sometimes that actually flatten the ways differences are captured. So all this, unconscious bias training and thinking about diversity, thinking about multiculturalism, they're actually also a way that depoliticize how different communities respond and how actually they are very different in understanding some of these issues. So anti-blackness is something obviously central to that. But we can come to that, and may I actually direct you to our 2023 Australia report and also 2023 Economic Empowerment Report and 2019 report on racial discrimination of the working group, where we actually go into details in those. Thank you.
Talking about Thailand, actually, it's a very complex case because you mentioned a marriage visa extension, for instance. You're not just showing up at immigration every 90 days. You have to show approve of 400,000 baht in your account every year to be able to extend your marriage visa. So it means if you must get married and live in Thailand, you must be rich, must, in capital letter. So if anything happens to you, you lose your visa and they send you packing. We've seen so many Nigerians who have similar problems. So currently they're living apart from their families. And just last week, some of them were calling us at the community level, pleading with us to see what we can do to help the kids reunite with their fathers in Africa, because the mothers can't give them the kind of care the father were giving to them. Just to give you an instance. So it's a real issue. It's also affecting the country. In blacks in Malaysia, I was in Malaysia, privileged to be in Malaysia on a field studies for a week in December. And we actually found 16, 17 years old African kids who have not been to school for a day because of the system. The Malaysian immigration law refused to recognize kids born under wedlock. It doesn't give them any kind of biological attachment to their father, so most of them can't even go home with the kids because they don't have the right paperwork when they have the kids. So naturally, they deny the biological, fatherhood. It's not there. So these kids are there, they can't go to school because under the Malaysian law, the absence of a registered resident address or having the right paper means the kids cannot go to public schools. So the migrant kids can only go to migrant study center, where basically they just teach them how to read the Quran. And we know what that has done to Nigeria in terms of Boko Haram. So basically teaching them to be literate so they can read the Quran. No mathematics, no science, no nothing. So it's a big problem. And I told them actually that these things has to be addressed now because it's like a time bomb. So these are real issues facing Africans and migrants within the region. And Southeast Asia is one of the regions with the highest number of stateless people. If you come from Africa and somebody's telling you someone is stateless, you imagine how is it possible? Because there's nothing like that in Africa. You either have a father or you have a mother. So how then do you become stateless? So you see, sometimes when people tolerate things like this, it turns back to haunt them. And these are real issues facing the region currently. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Gomez. I know you didn't get much to say there, but we'll catch you in the morning if you'd like to say a few more things. You're good? He's like, no, I'm good. I'm good with this group. All right, so please thank this panel for me, please. They did an incredible job. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That clock's ticking, isn't it?
Thank you, Dr. Keesee. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to all the participants.
Good morning. I declare and sorry for coming late. I declare the third meeting of the third panel of the regional meeting for Asia and the Pacific on the International Decade for People of African Descent open. For the next hour and a half, we'll continue our discussion under the panel discussion on justice. I would like to give the floor to Dr. Tracie Keesee, co-chair of the International Independent Expert Mechanism to Advance Racial Justice and Equality in the context of law enforcement, and who is the moderator for this panel of discussion. Dr. Keesee, you have the floor.
Thank you and good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Oh, you had a lesson yesterday. Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, I hope you all are well rested and now are getting tea and coffeeed up here. We have an exciting panel for you this morning, and I am so privileged to do introductions of your panel. And again, this is the second part from yesterday regarding justice. So let me start, if I could, and introduce our panel. Joining us via Zoom is Professor Shihan de Silva Isaria, is a senior associate at Lucy Cavendish College, University of Cambridge, a senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, School of Advanced Study, University of London, and a collaborative researcher at the University of Colombo. She was also a visiting professor at Rheinstein University in Kyoto, Japan, and a visiting fellow of the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam. Her research explores migration, commerce, and culture exchange in the Indian Ocean, African, Malay, and Portuguese diasporas with an historical, linguistic, and ethnological frame. Her publications explore many of the African identity in Asia. She is a former member of the Rapporteur of UNESCO's Slave Route Project she is currently. She's also the chair of the Sri Lanka National Scientific Committee for Intangible Cultural Heritage of the International Council on Monuments and Sites, and an international expert on members of this council. So welcome. Our next panel member is Councillor Imelda Davis. Councillor Davis is the first Black woman elected to serve on the City of Sydney City Council in its 180-year history. And I'm going to do a quick commercial pause for Black women in the room. This is a situation. Yeah. Congratulations. Yes, absolutely. Councillor Davis is a second-generation born Australian South Sea Islander, a descendant of the Pacific slave trade to the New South Wales. A passionate volunteer, community builder, she serves as the City of Sydney as Deputy Chair of the Resilient Communities and Economy Committee, the Lord Mayor's Delegate on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advisory Panel, the Lord Mayor's Delegate on the Multicultural Advisory Panel, and the alternate chair of the local Pedestrian Cycling and Traffic Calming Committee. She is advisor to several Australian South Sea Islander leaders and organizations and sits on the International Coalition Sites of Conscious Board of Trustees. Welcome. Mr. Mohammed El Naim is a Ph.D. candidate in sociology at Trinity Hall, Cambridge, and the director of the Decolonial Center at a UK-based organization that engages in political education on colonialism, anti-colonialism, and decoloniality. His research interests focus on relationship between capitalism, patriarchy and slavery, Black power in the Pacific, and the work of, and is it CARICOM? CARICOM, oh, wonderful. Reparations Commission, among other issues. He was active in the struggle for democracy in the Sudan and a supporter of the Black Lives Matter. Welcome. Also joining us via Zoom is Professor Antje Misbach. Is a professor of sociology at Bielefeld University in Germany, specializing in global and transnational migration and mobility. Her research interests include the socio-legal dimensions of forced migration in the South and Southeast Asia, border regimes, asylum policies, and refugee protection in the Asia Pacific, as well as diaspora politics, long-distance nationalism. She was a McKinsey postdoctoral fellow at the Melbourne Law School, and she also held positions as postdoctoral fellow at the Berlin Graduate School for Muslim Cultures and Society, and a lecturer at Ruprecht-Karls University in Heidelberg. She studied Southeast Asian Studies and European Ethnology at Humboldt University in Berlin, and obtained her Ph.D. from Australian National University in Canberra. Professor De Silva, we're going to have you take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon to you all, where I am now in Sri Lanka. It's afternoon. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First, I need to get my slides up. So, let me do screen share. Screen share. Oops. Can I get my slides up? Yes. Can you see my screen?
We can see your screen.
Can you see the screen? No?
We can.
You can't, okay.
We could. We could see it before. You had it up.
Okay, that's the, again then. Screen share. Can you see now?
We can see it now.
I can't turn them though. I can't see it.
Can you hear us? We can see it.
Yeah, I can see. I got to go back up. Yes. I was at the bottom of my slides. Okay, start again. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon from Sri Lanka. Recognizing the brutal uprooting of Africans and their contributions are essential in bringing about equity. So first, I'll give you the historical context briefly, and then speak about the agency and contributions of people of African descent in India and Sri Lanka. And finally, I'll make a few recommendations. Africans were part of the Indian Ocean trade networks as sailors, navy commanders, traders, soldiers, and missionaries. They moved both overland and by sea. After all, part of Africa's coast hugs the Indian Ocean. We know that free migrant Africans were judges, jurists, teachers, preachers, and religious leaders serving in pre-modern South Asia between the 12th and 15th centuries. Military soldiers were known in India from the 10th century. And in the 15th century, the rise of a freed Ethiopian elite military slave, Malik Amba, whose picture you see here, to the position of power, epitomizes the limitless social mobility and the authority that Africans commanded in India. Amba was the prime minister and the de facto ruler of a kingdom called Ahmednagar from 1600 until his death in 1626. And his tomb shows the respect that he commanded. Whilst his unparalleled life is due to his military capabilities and strategic skills, he is not the only African to enter the power echelons in India. The picture you see here is of Janjira Fort, where two princely states in India were ruled until 1948, until after India's independence, by Africans. The first is Janjira here in Maharashtra state today. It was ruled for 330 years, unbroken African rule. And another state, which is in today's Gujarat, called Sachin, was ruled for 150 years by Africans. But African rule begins earlier on the opposite side of India, in the eastern side, in the Bengal Sultanate, where Africans ruled for 7 years. There were 4 African leaders at the end of the 15th century. From the early modern period, European intervention in Indian Ocean trade meant that Africans were cogs in the wheels of the imperial machinery, serving as soldiers, servants, sailors, and musicians, for example. So now I'm going to turn to the southern Indian state of Karnataka, and more specifically to Uttara Kannada, North Karnataka, where Christian people of African descent are considered runaways from the Portuguese in neighboring Goa. This family you see here, the Haranodka Siddhi family, Juliana, the mother, Juje, the father, and Jonel, the daughter, and Julius, the son. Juje graduated with a commerce degree and works for the Employees Provident Fund as a government employee since 1998. And he's a national athlete, a hurdler. So because of that, he secured his job because of the sports quota. Uttara Kannada Siddhis were accorded scheduled tribe status in 2003. And this scheduled tribe status is a category in the Indian Constitution, which includes people who meet defined criteria like economically disadvantaged and geographically isolated. So, and a tribe in this context is not a derogatory term. It's used to distinguish them from castes, because there are scheduled castes and there are scheduled tribes. So scheduled tribe status entitles Siddhis to reserved quotas in educational establishments, fee concessions in schools and colleges, scholarships for fees in educational courses, relaxation or lowering of marks required in entrance exams, employment opportunities in government jobs, and loans to start businesses. And also they're given discounts or subsidies in government housing schemes, but they're not given gifts of land. But most Siddhis who have this status don't know how to draw upon their entitlements as scheduled tribes. Juliana is the first female of African descent to obtain a diploma in civil engineering. She entered Karwa College in Karnataka based on her advanced level results and not on the scheduled tribe quota. But she has not been able to find employment as an engineer. She now works as a freelance coordinator, providing models for the film industry in Mumbai, and also as the secretary for 708 flats spread out over 9 buildings. She also has a managerial job in Mumbai. Juje and Juliana, they both support their village, which is called Vada village, through creative entrepreneurships like gathering honey from the forest, purifying, bottling, and selling the bottled products to wholesalers. Juje also draws upon his contacts and mentors in the sports world to develop the skills of the Siddhi children in his village. Their son, Julius, topped the batch of students, getting 99.59% at the entrance exams for universities, and he's now in his 2nd semester reading for a computer engineering course in a university in Mumbai. So when I asked Juliana what she would like for the future of her community, she said, and I quote her, "Education is the way for everything, you know. So education is the basic thing where it can change the face of the community. So I would think children should get educated, definitely, because I know if they are educated, they will prosper in life," unquote. So though many cities in Karnataka now have university degrees, Juliana is concerned that the younger generation are distracted by exposure to television and by working in large domestic houses where they see different ways of attaining material prosperity. The scenario amongst people of African descent in Sri Lanka, in a Sri Lankan village whom I met 23 years ago, in a village called Sirambiadia, is different. Their oral history says that their ancestors arrived 200 years ago to help the British during a war. Demand for African soldiers was a major driver in the movement of Africans to Sri Lanka, even after abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, as we can see from the colonial archives records. This is a still from my film, which I have screened in Sri Lanka at the Institute of Ethnic Studies, which Dr. Michael Gomez is the director of. And I have also screened it in many other parts of the world to make visible these people. And I have known this community since my doctoral research on Sri Lanka Portuguese, a creolized language, which they call our language. So I approached the community as a linguistics researcher. And when I heard their music and chant-like songs, which they call manja, my interest broadened to include ethnomusicology, that is studying a society through music. A few years ago, they performed at the Bandaranaike Center for International Studies in Colombo when I spoke of the critically endangered state of manja. And I will play a clip of them performing at the end. They formed a 12-member group, but only 6 were able to come to Colombo because of the post-COVID economic conditions. With indigenization, other cultural elements have adapted, but I find that music and dance are held on to by the diasporas as a key element of identity, tied to religious practices sometimes, or otherwise as secular forms. So these cultural memories are very strong connectors to Africa, but it's not all song and dance. Although they have moved from the village to the stage, their performances are undervalued and they are underpaid. The community needs to be empowered in skills to negotiate for their talents. Though Manya somewhat essentializes the community, it has become a significant income earner for a community whose scope for gainful employment is limited because 2/3 of the community are women. And this is Marie Jacinta, the best dancer in the community. She, in 1999, appealed to the nation through the Sunday Leader, a newspaper, and they don't speak English, so the newspaper quoted them in translation. And I quote, "Our poverty is our plight. We have no way of doing anything about it. Our culture is our song and dance. It's the only inheritance left behind by our forefathers. We owe this form of livelihood to our children. Please help us," unquote. I want to conclude by recommending that a regional meeting be held in Asia to increase local awareness of the nuanced histories and the varied contributions of people of African descent, and to invite Juliana Sidi to that meeting to speak about the challenges that she faces, because seeing, after all, is believing. And also, I want to recommend that the Ceylon African Manja group should perform at that event. Thank you for listening. And Chair, how many minutes more do I have? Because I'll play a clip according to the number of minutes that you can give me.
I'll give you a few minutes to play the clip because we all want to hear it. So please.
So the music starts when it gets fast. Right.
Professor De Silva? And look at that, natural stuff. That's what I'm talking about. Thank you so much, Professor De Silva, for your rich presentation and the joy from the dance. You forget how much joy dance brings you and music. So thank you so much. I'd now like to invite Chancellor Davis to take the floor.
Good morning, Olgeta. I've got a video that I want to play, if that's possible.
Yeah, the three shared that same struggle, destined of the hard life, forgetting in the trouble.
Music, stories and a fight for justice united young people of colour at a Black Leadership Forum held in Mount Druitt.
Three shared that same struggle, destined of the hard life, forgetting in the trouble.
Music, stories and a fight for justice united young people of colour at a Black Leadership Forum held in Mount Druitt.
It's a human thing, first and foremost, to respect the knowledge of our elders and to take on board that teaching as opposed to, you know, the broader education system, and look at how we can empower, sustain, survive, and I guess save our children.
We have a shared, I guess, sense of value and morals and I guess similar experience in terms of oppression. When we talk about things like white dominant culture.
Inspiring those young leaders were elders and speakers focusing on the Black themes of bold leadership, awareness, culture and knowledge.
Well, they need to know to be strong. It's not cool to be a juvenile or go to jail. We need those good young people we saw here today to start working with our young.
And a former child soldier and refugee was a key inspirational speaker. Deng Adut told of what motivated him to conquer his past and become a defence lawyer in Western Sydney.
If you are a child and you are in prison, and you are the person that's been targeted for obviously whatever reason it is, and we know obviously what reason it is, then I'll give my life for you.
Decolonising the curriculum was one key theme.
Traditionally, a lot of people from varying backgrounds, including our backgrounds, don't see education as part of their life plan. They normally see that as for those that are outside of our cultures. Education is for everyone. Education is transformational and really is an equaliser.
Another key was truth as a political weapon, correcting the false narratives of history. Etwa Mabuto is a refugee from the Democratic Republic of the Congo who said her schooling in Australia had huge historical gaps.
Today when we heard Dr. Ahmed talking about the why is my curriculum so wide, it was just like, yeah, I related so much with his talk and the way he was talking about the initiative that he's doing with like the campaigning and stuff like that. So it was a very eye-opening.
The workshop was inspired to bring back collaborative activism by the Black Power movement of the 1960s and 70s.
And looking at how that aligns itself with a lot of the discrimination and racism that Indigenous Australians are facing today.
Focus on your spirituality. Focus on your unity. Focus on your self-enlightenment. I think by working that way, both together with white people, because you don't exclude white people too. They got to fix the problem they created. And you got to fix your problem too. And we're all going to work in it together because it's our problem, it's humanity problem.
Say peace, love, and unity. We say peace.
The Black Workshop wrapped up with the formation of a youth advisory group on matters affecting all people of colour.
Thanks so much, and I'll get the PowerPoint. Lots of bits and pieces this morning. Well, it's indeed an honour to be here. My name is Wasicum Imelda Davis, and I'm the chair of a not-for-profit voluntary organisation for over 2 decades called Australian South Sea Islanders Port Jackson. Port Jackson relates to Sydney Harbour, it's the colonial term, and the image that I've got up here is in homage and recognition of those elders that worked with me back in 2009 to actually form this organisation. We are guided from a cultural framework as Australian South Sea Islanders, but also we are of diverse black cultures. And one of the, I guess, the mantras for our organisation is very much about working across diversity and working together. As Dang Adut just said, you know, we can't exclude white people from the equation, but it is very much about self-determination and those that need to respect our leadership in this space. My story represents is representative of many stories in Australia which show that there is intersectional and diversity within the Black Oceanic demographic, as there are many connections back to the continent of Africa, and my family is just one example. I wrote my statement from the perspective of a Melanesian black woman in Australia of diverse cultural backgrounds. My father migrated from the Caribbean, and his lineage connects me to the African continent. My mother's heritage is Australian South Sea Islander. She's first generation born out of slavery. My grandfather was stolen from the island of Vanuatu in the Pacific. He was 12 years old. My great-great-grandmother was stolen from Umbai in the Pacific. She was 14 years old and put on a plantation in Maryborough to work as a house girl. My great-great-grandfather, my nana's father, was from a mission in Hervey Bay because they absorbed us on Aboriginal reserves, plantations. I guess, you know, the sugar industry is the thriving industry that connects us globally as well. So we work from this perspective of a global, inclusive approach to the social justice and human rights work that we're doing. So there's a map. Oh, hang on, I've got to change it. So just acknowledging our board there, and my son and daughter, Shola, Omashola, Jop, and Binet. Jop are there in that photo as well. They are founding in bringing our youth and community with us, making sure that we educate our children on the importance of I guess, cultural knowledge and being able to position yourself in such a white dominant culture, if that makes sense. So this map here demonstrates the some 800 routes that brought our people from the Pacific nations, from the Black Oceania region of Asia Pacific. And the top right-hand map, Black Oceania, is my heritage and my mother's heritage, which also includes Aboriginal Australia, as you can see positioned there above the Australian, I guess, state of the Northern Territory. So the below map, which with lots of colours, that demonstrates the some 500 Aboriginal clans pre-colonisation that existed and lived and thrived. Australia is a black country. It's a black man's land. Today we have some 230 surviving languages. 120 of those languages are still being maintained and spoken. When you look at the kinship, and I say to the government through advocacy and the work that we do, you look at the kinship and you look at black cultures. The first man to plant sugar in Australia was from the Caribbean. There were Africans on the first fleet in 1788. The Pitt families are evident in our Torres Strait Islander communities, that pointy bit up there. There were 3,000 of our Vanuatu people, Solomon's Melanesian peoples, brought through to settle. There were 62,500 in total over a 40-year period. A young history, but nothing to be ignored. Some of those names that sit in our communities that link back to East-West Africa are the Malamu, the Tambo, the Togo, the Korowa and the Nauru families, and these are islands as well named in the Pacific. But this is to be unpacked, and that's why I want to, at this point, acknowledge the working group of experts on peoples of African descent country visit to Australia on invitation by the Australian government. I am here because of that working group, and there's nothing like self-determination to make this happen for us, because only we know where our people are and where they sit in the intersectionality of a broader community, whether that be black, white, culturally and linguistically diverse. We are a community that is a minority in Australia significantly amongst our First Nations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and we're still struggling for a voice some 176 years later. And that's what I raised with our human rights, chair yesterday. What about us? 230 years of settlement, what about us? Because we have that evident kinship. And those Pit families and African families of the Torres Strait still need a voice from this advocacy work that we're doing. I just wanted to also acknowledge, as a part of the civil rights and black power movement in Australia, I didn't put this in my statement, I sort of rant and go off, but I want to acknowledge Carol Johnson. She was a black ballerina that graduated from Juilliard in New York. She came to Australia in the 1960s with Elio Pomare, and her work in African dance fused with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and Australian South Sea Islander culture is what informs social justice for First Nations people, the blueprint, of how to work better together in Australia. And that created a whole movement that saw us working towards the 1967 referendum, informed by the Black Panther movement from the US, informed by our people that travelled to the United States to look at and study that Black Panther movement, and bringing it back and establishing, Aboriginal dance theatres, Aboriginal medical centres. So I pay homage to Carol Johnson, who's been in my life since I was 14. But she is the founder of, I don't know if you heard of Black Theatre, Aboriginal and Islander Dance Theatre Redfern, the NAISDA, National Aboriginal and Islander Dance Skills, and also Bangarra Dance Theatre, which is a world-renowned dance company today. And still, she is not recognised for the work that she does and has done for our people in this country. And it's also black politics, right? So, we get skilled, we get very professional, we get incredibly influential, and we find that we're locking our own out a lot of the time. So our work is very much about pathways. Yes, I'm fortunate to be a counsellor, single mother of 2, Year 12 education, did my Masters in Children of the Sugar Slaves, Oral Histories, Black and Resilient at the age of 60. So it's about self-determination, and where is your heart with this work? Yeah? How do you want your families to, move forward in life and have access and equity that our forebears fought for? So we need to not forget how we got here. And that's what I find a lot with what's happening with politics today, is that we're blocking our own. So my policy at the City of Sydney is, I'm ranting, I'm off track, but that's okay. My policy at the City of Sydney is very much about open door. So whoever you are, marginalised groups or not, come see me. Not a problem. And it's been quite a significant, experience, Noel, because I look forward to working also with my cohort and good friend here that I've travelled to Geneva with the African Australian Advocacy Centre Chair, and commend you on the work that you're doing, because they don't recognise us, but we're hardworking, we get up, it's every breath of the day. So I commend you, brother, for your work. So, as I said, Australian South Sea Islanders are the descendants of some 60-odd thousand that were stolen from Pacific nations. 1.5 million Indigenous and Asian individuals were a part of this blackbird trade from the 1840s to the 1950s, And then the 60-odd thousand that came to Australia, there was a mass deportation under the White Australia policy of some 7,000 of our people. And that White Australia policy actually informed apartheid in South Africa. But still today we're living under the remnants of that, so don't ever think it's been abolished or slavery hasn't continued, because now we've got a seasonal Pacific labour mobility scheme. We've been advocating for the last 15 years to stop modern slavery in Australia, and have written and informed some of that trafficking that's going on and the challenges for our people that they're again bringing in to Australia to pick the fruit and hold the economy up. We are the first blackbirders or descendants of slavery, and now it's starting again in the 21st century. There's 39,000 Pacific Island and Timor-Leste representatives in Australia today holding up the Australian economy, people of colour. So, black determination, I've worked a lot with our wonderful board across a diverse range of community groups. We don't discriminate. The Pacific is black, you know, let's be real with all of this. Yes, we have the Polynesian, the Micronesian, the Melanesian are the dominant culture, but we have the smallest voice. And this is just some of the work in reconnecting with my country in Vanuatu, and they acknowledge me giving my traditional name, the Council of Chiefs, as Wazakum, which allows me to stand in the Nakamal, that's the Nakamal to the right where the chiefs meet, and speak amongst the chiefs, while the women have to sit. I have used that power a few times in going back and supporting with climate justice work that we do from a voluntary capacity. The bottom image on the left is that a lot of the work that we do in climate change, because the islands are sinking, and the consciousness in raising Indigenous peoples' voices through Indigenous peoples' organisations, self-determination again. And on the right, that's I'm a part of the City of Sydney governing team. These are my cohorts, formidable team. The City of Sydney is a fantastic social justice platform for advancing recognition and support for all cultures, but in particular, my first port of call was to recognise Australian South Sea Islanders as a distinct cultural group, but also to recognise that we have systemic racism issues across the workplace, and how do we dismantle that. So now we're working with a number of people to look at unpacking some of the challenges that and I've also put them in touch with Mr. Dudu Jen from the UN and the board that I sit on, the International Coalition Sites of Conscience, because he was the United Nations specialist on racism, global racism. I'm very proud of my father's name was Clayton Augustine Davis, and he was born on the island in the Caribbean called Grenada, and lived in a township of Crochu. I've never been there. St Andrews, Clayton's heritage is a result of the African slave trade, culminating in his bloodlines from the aboveancestry.com. So I did my DNA out of interest in tracing my oral history research through the communities in Australia, but also curious about my father's ancestry. It shows that I am, and there's a map in my statement, that I'm 30% Nigerian, Senegalese, and a number of other African countries, which is awesome, and you can see it, right? And there's a lot of discrimination around. It's all in there. Hey, yeah, it's all there. Black all day. So there's been a lot of discrimination, black on black, with me in the leadership role for this Australian South Sea Islander recognition, and they say, oh, she's nothing but an African. Yeah? And then the Caribbean mob are like, oh, where's she from? I don't know. Yeah? Yeah, it's just like, I'm like, well, care factor 0, so I just get on with the business. But that gives me strength in knowing who I am and what I stand for when I walk around in Australia, which people think is predominantly white, but because most people come to the global cities and they are predominantly white, but when you go out to the regions, it's like you're in another country. So I encourage the United Nations, if we do get this extension for another 10 years, another 50 years it should be, in my opinion, because slavery went on for a long time, the dispossession, the displacement, yeah. It's impossible to try and, I guess, I guess, regain that identity and that sense of belonging through short time periods like that in one's lifetime, yeah? I think my family, you know, I'm the proud mother of two incredibly grounded, unapologetically black children. They had no choice, who identify with all their heritage, even more so, more diverse than mine, because my son's father is from Nigeria, Omashola, meaning to bring goodwill, and my daughter's father is from Senegal. And I have never denied them the opportunity to continue to connect with their families. And a lot of these teachings, I believe, and we know, is about the consistency that you have in your family home and within your family unit. And that's how you bring about real change, is making sure that your kids are well educated and exposed to the good, the bad, the ugly, you know, with all the work that we do. And yeah, so I just wanted to recognise the work in particular of both my children's fathers, Tundi Dona, Baba Tunde Dona. He came to Australia in the late 80s, and he established himself as one of the #1 mortgage writers in New South Wales. Financially, he was, you know, in newspapers, celebrated entrepreneur, incredible in supporting communities. To give a leg up, I called him a Robin Hood almost, because the manner in which he would provide support for other marginalised community groups. He didn't discriminate, but still he wasn't recognised for that wonderful work. Boubacar, my daughter's father, Babacar Diop, he was one of the first, and I managed the band for 5 odd years. I know, right? 2 kids managing this band. Formidable, Boubacar were, and they were nominated for an aria in 1998. But guess who won over the top of them? The Wiggles, a white kids show. And they did 5 years of hardcore, I mean, this guy's like, Unor, right? And then that's okay, so, you know, things dispersed after that, because it's hard trying to sustain. But we had a formidable following in Australia and all across the country. Then my sister-in-law, Fatou Ndoye, she opened one of the first black salons, or African salons, in Australia. And now she's been teaching across the Asia-Pacific region. She's representing Australia in hair and beauty, and I'm incredibly proud of that work that she's done in representing Senegal in particular. But she had that salon and still does for the last 30-odd years. Okay, I'll leave it there. Talking too much.
You're just going to leave it there and you drop it with global inclusive approach, and you're just going to leave it there. Okay, that's something else. I'd like to invite our next panelist, Mr. El Naim, to take the floor. Please, sir.
Okay, you can hear me now? Excellent, thank you. So I initially wanted to speak about the Black Power, the history of Black Power and the legacies of Black Power in the Pacific, and I will, but I should begin by saying that I defer to sister here who's got a lot more experience and is, you know, a living testament to these incredible things that we read about. But I will provide this only as an example of what I think is an incredible sense of a phenomenon that happened across the 1960s, across the world, where people of various descent groups, whether they're from India or of Indian descent or African descent, indigenous, had come around together under the concept of blackness, or to be black, in a way which went against the divisions that the colonial world tried to impose on the oppressed and colonized peoples of the world. And This story begins in the mid-60s. Some of the most committed civil rights activists are at this point disillusioned with the pace of change. Their new cry for Black power, often misunderstood by even their most sympathetic supporters, is in direct response to the structural violence in places like the United States, but elsewhere, which they knew they could not legislate away. It was not in the cities where the cry for Black power actually began, but it was actually instead in Lowndes County in Alabama, one of the poorest counties in the country. And the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, then under the leadership of a man called Stokely Carmichael, later to be called Kwame Ture, and John Hollett, took up the slogan Black Power and the symbol of the Black Panther as their own. Everything they thought they knew about white terrorism was proven wrong. 80% of the population were Black, but nobody was registered to vote. When they tried to exercise that right to vote, they were shot at, tortured, killed. The role of the police in Alabama was to uphold this system, as was the Democratic Party, which had a cock at its symbol and took up the phrase white supremacy for the right as their motto. And with their orthodoxy of Gandhian nonviolence unable to hold, the Lowndes County Freedom Organization came to adopt the panther as their mascot in response. The rationale was that a panther, always patient, will nevertheless pounce back if put into a corner. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, under Stokely Carmichael's leadership, cried Black Power by saying that the only solution was for political and economic power for Black people. Now, it's within this broader context, as well as a rebellion that happens in Watts, Los Angeles, that the Black Panther Party would be born in Oakland, California. The Black Panther Party was a Marxist and Black Power political organization founded by college students Bobby Seale and Huey Newton in 1966. The party was active in the United States between 1966 and 1982, with chapters in many major American cities, including San Francisco, New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, Seattle, and Philadelphia. They were also active in many prisons and had international chapters in the United Kingdom and Algeria. At its inception, the party's primary activity involved open carry patrols, what today we would call cop watching, specifically directed at the Oakland Police Department. In the latter part of 1968, Bobby Seale and David Hilliard redirected the party's focus towards organizing community initiatives, such as providing free breakfasts for children, which terrified the United States government. By 1969, every Panther chapter was actively engaged in community services. By the summer of that year, the party estimated that it was providing free breakfast to 10,000 children daily who were not getting that breakfast in school. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, was so worried about these developments that he called the Black Panther Party the greatest threat to national security in the United States. As the Black Panthers attracted young African Americans to their revolutionary agenda, the party emerged as a crucial bridge connecting the domestic Black liberation struggle in the US with global victims of American imperialism. The North Vietnamese, then in an anti-colonial liberation struggle against the United States, utilized the Black Panther Party as a conduit to send letters to the families of American prisoners of war and explore the possibility of releasing prisoners of war in exchange for the freedom of Panthers held in US jails. Cuba extended political asylum to Black Panthers and initiated the establishment of a military training ground for them. Algeria, a focal point of Pan-Africanism and a global center for anti-imperialism, accommodated embassies for numerous post-colonial governments and independence movements. Algeria granted the Panthers national diplomatic status and provided them with an embassy building, serving as the headquarters for the international section. And of course, the Black Panthers were also a global phenomenon, as was the Black Power movement. In India, a group emerged which called itself the Dalit Panthers. And in Australia and New Zealand, Black Panther Party chapters were created by Aboriginals, Maori, and Pacific peoples. More offshoots included the Black Panther movement in Britain, the Black Beret cadre of Bermuda. The concept of being Black was not new to them. The word, as we've also learned, blackbirding, for example, which is the coercion of people through deception or kidnapping, was developed because Australian peoples used the word Black against the peoples of the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji, to demean them. And this was a term they had used for centuries. James Matla, an early settler of Australia in 1783, claimed that the land of Aboriginals was peopled by only a few Black inhabitants who, in the rudest state of society, knew no other arts than such as were necessary to their normal animal existence. So thus there was a receptivity to the term Black Power, because the word Black, which a group usually referred to at that time as Negroes in the United States took up a new meaning. It meant beauty, it meant power, it meant strength. It became a rallying cry to diverse peoples across the world. And so we'll just take the Australian Black Panther Party, for example. It was in 1967 that the indigenous peoples of Australia were given full citizenship following a referendum. Yes, you heard that right, 1967. Taking inspiration from the civil rights movement, they had their own freedom rides. They campaigned against segregation and won citizenship rights for the native people of the country. But legislative action didn't seem sufficient. A 1966 census revealed that Aboriginals' mortality levels, standards of health, and employment rates were far lower than their white counterparts. Police brutality was especially rampant. By 1969, a Victorian Indigenous activist, Bruce McGuinness, was urging all Aboriginals to get a copy of Stokely Carmichael's Black Power book. All across the country, Aboriginal activists were reading Frantz Fanon, Bobby Seale, Angela Davis, Malcolm X. In 1970, a delegation of indigenous peoples went to Atlanta to participate in a Congress of African people. Artists went to Harlem to learn about Black theater, as we learned. And many came back with black berets and Afro hairdos like the one that Angela Davis wore. And in 1971, a young activist called Dennis Walker, son of the famed Kath Walker, abandoned his family's commitment to just pacifist civil rights and also reinforced his work by forming the Australian Black Panther Party with people like Paul Coe and Gary Foley and Gary Williams, Sam Watson. They set up their headquarters in Redfern, Sydney, a site of intense activism and intense police brutality. And I mean, this was a situation where sometimes they would just be hanging out in the hotel and the police would come in and just start attacking people and beating them up. And in 1988, one activist recalled that when they read Malcolm X's autobiography, that it could have been written about me and other black fellas around Redfern, he said. He said, one day Coe started talking seriously about how we were going to sort these policemen out, and he gave us some Black Panther books. He said, and specifically on the concept of cop watching, he said, this is a great idea, read this. But they didn't just go to just observe police brutality. They acquainted themselves with tape recorders, law books. They set up the first Aboriginal legal service of New South Wales. They worked with barristers and professors. They set up a medical service. And they did this while continuing to stand with the black people across the world. Now, this concept of black as a political color, whether we're talking about it in Guyana and Trinidad or in the South Africa under Biko's Black Consciousness movement, it was a global phenomenon. In neighboring New Zealand, some indigenous and Maori activists debated if they should call their movement brown power instead. But as Zena Tamuni, an activist based in Otara and a delegate at the first Black women's meeting in Nagati, Otara, said in 1980, to be a black woman encapsulated to them the common bond of being the lowest, the most oppressed, the only ones to lead the revolution. As the delegates of this conference put it, brown power wasn't appropriate because a black woman taught by whites how to be white learns to hate her blackness and prefers to be brown so she can feel comfortable and close, even closer to being white. Now, in 1974, Mildred Sope, a leader in the women's wing of the New Hybrids National Party, in today what we would call Vanuatu, was sent as part of a 4-person delegation to the 6th Pan-African Congress. She fought against nuclear testing in Tahiti and called for a common front between Africa and the Pacific to denounce colonialism and nuclear testing. Her husband, Barack Sope, future Prime Minister of Vanuatu, went so far as to argue that colonized territories like theirs had the same fight as those in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and South Africa. French officials were alarmed at what they called the dangerous liaison with Tanzania among the people of Vanuatu. Colonialism fears that kind of unity. And just to go off script a bit, that kind of unity we are seeing today as South Africa takes Israel to the International Court of Justice for the crime of genocide against the Palestinian peoples. What I just said in Vanuatu was an alliance that was being built of people who were marginalized by colonialism, who stood together and said that we stand with the people of Angola, the people of Namibia. Now, what's on trial today is not just the state of Israel, but international law. International law is on trial. And it shocks me that we are witnessing the first televised and live-streamed genocide. And on the same day as the anniversary of the Nama and Herero genocide, Germany said that they would stand and defend Israel's decimation of Gaza. Now, for me, this is Afro-Asian solidarity in practice. When the Gambia took Myanmar, for example, to the International Court of Justice, when South Africa takes Israel to the International Court of Justice, it is saying that we believe in this concept of international law. And when Israel says that they will not accept the mandate of the International Court of Justice, it is saying that it does not believe in the international law. And I think that it's really important for us to bring this up because yesterday Namibia released a statement, or 2 days ago Namibia released a statement, saying that it was offensive to them that on the very same day of the anniversary of the Nama and Herero genocide, Germany says that it's going to stand with the state of Israel. Now, there's something that needs to be understood, and this is something that it seems that goes beyond their heads. It is not just the crime against the Jewish people which is the crime of the Holocaust. It is the principle of genocide which is the problem. And it seems to me that many European nations today seek to only condemn the moment, the episode of the Holocaust, but not the principles that went into it. The genocide against the Nama and Herero people, the principles that went into the genocide against the Nama and Herero people, went on to inform the Holocaust. The reality of the matter is this. The Afro-Asian solidarity, Afro-Asian Pacific solidarity is what entails the hope and civilization of humanity. And that is on trial today. And we must stand against the genocide in Gaza. And so I hope you all can accept and forgive me for bringing this up at this hall, because I cannot just sit by and say nothing. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. El Naim. Thank you for comments and lifting, and especially as we talk about these notions of blackness that are very still prevalent today, but also how it's tied to our liberation. And when we say this, it's not just our liberation in the West, it is global. So I appreciate you lifting that as well. Professor Misbach, I'd like to invite you, please.
Hello, good morning to you all, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, dear chair. I feel very privileged to be able to contribute to this really important meeting. And let me start with some general numbers before I will then comment on some observations from my own research that I have been conducting on asylum seekers and refugees in Southeast Asia. And I will be mostly speaking on the example of Somali refugees and the incipient Somali diaspora in Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia. Now, there are around 11 million African-born migrants that are living in Europe, about 5 million African-born migrants in Asia, and 3 million in Northern America. The precise numbers available for Southeast Asia are not available, but it's probably safe to assume that the numbers are relatively small. And unfortunately, the scarcity of reliable statistical data on Africans residing in Southeast Asia is also accompanied by some limited academic research, particularly about the contemporary movements and residencies. As the previous speakers have already pointed out, Africans come to Southeast Asia as students, but also as expats, labor migrants, spouses, sojourners, tourists, and refugees. Now, the reason that some people decide to apply for protection in Southeast Asia is not the quality of the refugee protection available in Southeast Asia, but rather it is the lenient visa policies that make Southeast Asia somehow an attractive destination to them. Despite the small numbers of African refugees, in public and also in social media, they tend to be portrayed in very discriminative and sensational ways. Racism in Asia is spurred by biological and cultural elements. Whether new or old racism is a display of political economic power and always manifests in intersectional ways. Many Southeast Asians might never have encountered people of African descent directly, and yet many of them tend to have tainted racist stereotypes. And prejudices are fed by racist portrayals in the Western entertainment industry, but also local media narratives and also domestic superstition that tends to equate Black with sadness, lower power, and so on and so on. As I said, I would like to concentrate on the plight of the Somali refugees in Southeast Asia, as they are the largest and fastest growing group of African refugees in the 3 countries. And there's also a little bit more of academic research available on them. Here are just a few numbers that give you an idea what other African refugees are applying for protection in Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Racism is both a cause and a product of forced displacement. And in my talk, I'm trying to talk about 2 kinds of vulnerabilities: that of refugees, whose vulnerability is often connected to illegality, deportability, low wages, and of course that of racially discriminated people. So in a way, these 2 vulnerabilities come together. And they collate, and perhaps we can even say that they form a sense of like a hyper vulnerability. Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, they do not perceive themselves as immigrant nations, despite the fact that they do actually host a substantial number of various kinds of migrants. The 3 countries are not signatories to the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. None of the 3 countries has a legal framework for effective refugee protection. And most decisions to deal with new arrivals of refugees are made on an ad hoc basis. Sovereignty is jealously guarded and considered fundamental to state survival in Southeast Asia. Until now, refugee issues often remain overshadowed by politicized discourses on securitization and populist anti-immigrant backlashes. Policymakers in Indonesia, Thailand, migration, and Malaysia tend to perceive refugees only in humanitarian terms, which means states are prepared to offer basic help for limited periods of time, but their offers for help are based on the conditions that require the international community to step in, for example, with the help of expedited resettlements, which are often hard to realize. Unwilling to accept the political realities that Southeast Asian countries are no longer just transit countries for African refugees on their way to the global north, this results in a kind of stranded situation of limbo in Southeast Asians, where African refugees as non-citizens live for many years, 10 years and longer, without basic rights. So in a way, African refugees attract more hostile reactions from the host society, but also from state authorities. Somali people have been fleeing from Somalia for more than 30 years due to the war, but also because of terrorism, droughts, and famines. The diaspora in Southeast Asia is still very young. So basically only for the last 15 years have we seen more noticeable numbers of Somalis coming. And also the age of the people who do arrive tends to be relatively young. People are in their 20s, early 30s. And this exodus of the youth from Somalia is, of course, very much shaping the current immigration. Particularly noteworthy is that relatively high percentage of Somali women. And that, of course, raises a lot of questions about their migration pathways. So the levels of their vulnerability, I would argue, are higher compared to other refugee groups, also because they tend to receive less local charity. When it comes to survival, it's important to mention that refugees do not have work rights in Southeast Asia, and yet they need to carve out a living with the help of odd jobs, short-term informal employment. Some people might be able to find work as translators if they speak the local languages. They might also get employment as domestic workers, or some of them work in African or Arab-owned hotels and restaurants. But the point here is that this kind of employment makes them, of course, very vulnerable to exploitation, including sexual exploitation. Men tend to work in construction or as porters. Ute Ruschenheller has also talked about hustling, a variety of ways making money that meander between the informal, the formal, the legitimate, the illegitimate activities that also sometimes constitutes and taking a financial advantage of each other. Now, on the one hand, African refugees in Southeast Asia tend to be hyper visible, but on the other hand, they're also forced to live under the radar. Unlike in other countries, they do not live in camps, but most refugees would prefer to live in cosmopolitan cities such as Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok, and Jakarta, which grants them, on the one hand, more anonymity and also access to the informal sector. Yet at the same time, they're also competing with locals who are living in rather precarious conditions. As I mentioned before, they suffer more from racial discrimination. When it comes to finding informal work, accommodation, they tend to be overcharged for housing, medical treatment, and other services. From my observations, I noticed that people face everyday racism displayed by individuals, but also by the wider host society. Somali refugees reported about institutional discrimination and structural racism, as some of the following quotes attest. A sentence which people hear very often is that we did not invite you to come here. If you're not happy, go back to your country. Somali refugees, they are more often searched and arrested by local authorities. First, we search their bodies, then we search their passports. Aside from the racism that they receive from the host society, refugees experience prejudiced behavior also from fellow, that is, non-Black refugees in the shelters where some of them live together with other refugees. Now, these anecdotal observations by me and other colleagues, they tend to be confirmed also by some indexes that I came across. For example, Amnesty International has this Refugee Welcome Index, and we can see that Indonesia and Thailand basically score on the second last and the third last of the places when it comes to receiving refugees. There's another index I'd like to share here. It's the World Value Index, where people are being asked whether they would, who would you not like to have as your neighbors? And again, the people who answered that they wouldn't want to live next to people from a different race were substantially high across Southeast Asia. Now, what constitutes racism in Southeast Asia? A number of scholars claim that racism in Southeast Asia is rather different from racism in other parts of the world, not least because it's founded in different historical legacies. As post-colonial nation states, racism is, of course, a central theme in Indonesia and Malaysia's history, and it continues to reverberate in all facets of society, art, literature. Even though Thailand was never formally colonized, yet it charts some of the colonialist thought that has bled into the Thai society, and Western imperialist foreign domination dictated its history with Thailand, heavily borrowing from colonial stationary imperial customs and legal codes. According to Parvati Raghuram, Asia arguably has a different complexion of its racial hierarchization, which has emerged sometimes in parallel and unconnected to Western racism, but sometimes is also entangled with it. So how does racism play out in Southeast Asia? First of all, religious and ethnic racial minorities tend to be targeted. There's a long-standing academic research on xenophobia, but racism nowadays is also entangled with colorism, cultural chauvinism, ethnic superiority, and classism. In Indonesia, I have noticed that Indonesians discriminate fellow Indonesians, particularly from the eastern parts of Indonesia, including West Papua and the Moluccans, because of their darker complexions. And in fact, sometimes Somali refugees are being called Papua as a way to devaluate them and to offend them. However, Afrophobia as such is a rather recent phenomenon in Southeast Asia, I would argue. Now, what is being done in Southeast Asia to stop the devaluation of Black lives? And of course, there are many initiatives, both top-down approaches when it comes to enforcing anti-discrimination laws, reporting, monitoring, but also festivals that are being organized by foreign ministries in conjunction with African organizations, such as example the Colors of Africa Festival in Bangkok. So we have this top-down approach, and on the other hand, we also have bottom-up approaches that seek to increase public awareness. The Black Lives Matter movement has resonated substantially in Indonesia, for example. And of course, there's also ethnic bonding and ethnic solidarity in niche formation that create solidarity and resistance. Now, I have probably painted a rather daunting picture, and I do not wish to end my talk on such a sad note, but I'd rather point out to a very impressive initiative established by a young Somali woman in Jakarta and her multi-ethnic colleagues. The name of this NGO is A Sisterhood, and it's an NGO by women for women, and they're concentrating in their work on education and livelihoods, most of all for refugees. And I would very much encourage you to go and check out their website, the wonderful work, and to support them. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Misbach, for your information. And I'd like to invite the delegates now to participate from the states of Asia and the Pacific region to make comments or ask questions, and just to remind you that you have 2 minutes for your intervention. And so I also wanted to offer a reminder that you can send in written statements if you'd like to. And I don't know if we have the email address up, or can we get the email address up for folks? We'll get that up while we're doing that. So right now, up front, Lau, please. And then anyone else, please raise your name placards so we can call on you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wish to comment on across the presenter, because, you know, yesterday I mentioned about the interaction between Asia and Africa. I mentioned Bandung back in 1955, and you may notice that Bandung Asia-African meeting has produced a great impact on both regions. It opened an era of national liberation, and it gives the consciousness to everybody, Asia and Africa, that they have to fight for their national liberation, and resulting in a significant movement in Asia and Africa for the national liberation. And this is Bandung back in 1955. But I also wish to mention one very unknown fact, that the impact of the first Indochina war against the French. And you may be aware that in the French troop expedition group, colonial army, they have more than 70% of African, ranging from Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Mauritanian, down to Guinea, Senegal, and Congo, among others. And you know that they have been defeated by the Indo-Chinese. And by the end of the war, it ended up with 20,000 of war prisoners has been catched by the Vietnamese. And the Vietnamese has been very genuine in organizing different camps for the French peoples and the African. This is, to my view, it is a positive discrimination and different treatment. The African friends benefited higher ratio for food, better treatment, more freedom in the movement, and they also benefited political cost for them. And it ended up, you may recall that Geneva Convention in 54 with the defeat of France, and 59 liberation of Algeria. And you may notice that the freedom fighter in the Algerian force, liberation force, was mainly those coming back from Indochina. So this is, I wish to mention this to pinpoint on the interrelationship between Asia and Africa. Sorry, one more minute. It is really a pity that, there are attempts to bring us together and closer in a very macro way. I mentioned the Afro-Asian Games, which has been happening only once, and now it has been indefinitely postponed. And this game happened in India from 24 October to 1st November 2003. And this game assembled 2,040 competitors from 96 nations. And within 96 nations, 43 from Asia and 55 from Africa. And it had 131 sporting events in over 32 disciplines. So to my view, it is one of the best non-political security events which may bring us together and seal us together for a better comprehension and friendship. And last, I wish to mention that, yesterday, some of you mentioned about the stateless situation in different regions in Asia, Southeast Asia. As I chair, I wish to inform you that we are conducting, because we are aware that the stateless status is a concern, and we are trying to address. And with a lot of satisfaction, the last meeting we had in Hanoi, we noticed that many progress, significant progress has been performed in different ASEAN member countries. I take the Thai situation. If you are from a minority ethnic group in Thailand, never you would be given the citizenship. As of recently, from last year, they have delivered Thai citizenship to 280,000 people in Thailand, not only for the minority ethnic group, but also for the migrant, and including the foreign overseas migrant worker there, provide that if they can certify that they have worked, they have been living over 7 years in Thailand, working in Thailand, and or if they are married to a Thai lady or a Thai husband. So this is Thailand. Malaysia also performed well, and they are in the process of reviewing the law in order to reduce to the maximum the people with the status of stateless.
I'm going to cut you off just for a second. Thank
Yes,
you for
thank
all
you.
your information.
Thank you.
I've got other folks that are waiting too. So any states, representative states, before we move on to folks who have comments? Any comments, questions? You, and then here. And I'm going to keep you to your 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Yes, Hong Jiang Huang from the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. I appreciate the presentation by all the panelists, and I learned a lot today. Thank you so much. And I just, at the outset, I would like to join to add my voice to Ambassador Takelanshi. He mentioned about the Bandung conference in 1955. I think this is a milestone event in history between, the cooperation and solidarity between Asia and Africa. And because we share the view, we share the will, and also the project in fighting against imperialism, colonialism, and in slavery. And this is the foundation, for a further cooperation between the two continents and even beyond. This is the first point. And the second point, I appreciate also the comments by Madame Davis. Your family chronicle actually is a testimony of the history of the people of African descent in different parts of the world, Asia Pacific in particular. And I think this is also calling us to ask the member states to promote education on the history of people of African descent, history on the tragic consequences of colonialism in slavery, and also the transatlantic trade of enslaved Africans. And because the consequences on people of African descent still persist in many parts of the world. And that is also the root causes of what we are facing: racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia in many parts of the world against people of African descent. And that is why we are here to make our voice heard, and also we are here to ensure that the second decade be extended and focusing on reparatory justice, and also to call on member states and international stakeholders to reject the wrongdoings of the past and to promote and protection the rights of people of African descent. And I believe that this is an important task. We need to work together. The third point is that I think that even as a Chinese, I have spent several years in several African countries. My own experience, including in Liberia, in South Sudan, in Ethiopia, has taught me a lot that there's still a long way to go, because we cannot leave our brothers and sisters in Africa and also the Afro diaspora behind the sustainable development goals. And so I believe that in our next panel, we will discuss more. And also that I would say that being a member of the forum, I know the task is daunting, but I believe and I hope that with our concerted efforts, we can make things better. Thank you.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much to all the speakers this morning. I think I'm Associate Professor Mimi Watts from Melbourne, Australia. Originally was born in Cameroon. I'm one of the brain drains, so I don't fit some of the narratives. So I guess listening to all the presentations this morning, something that stood out very clearly was the significant work that is being done around the world. But most often than not, people know what they are doing, and we don't really have a common platform. But listening to the story of Councillor Davis and also what Mr. Elnem shared from Sudan, I think it is imperative that we must have not just forums like this frequently, but we really have to have connected platforms where people can come together. And to that effect, last year at Mombasa, the African Union officially gave the mandate for the True Asterisk, African Science Research Innovation Council, for an African Studies Institute in Australia. That was reiterated when I was in Morocco later in December as well. So I think it is really important, and I think a forum like this, having a platform such as the Institute of African Studies. And prior to that, I had approached different academic institutions, and I am an academic in the country. And I can tell you not a single institution is willing to put their money. However, should we back and put in resources, whether we start virtual, like the virtual Pan-African universities and all of that, then this will be effective, because this is knowledge that people in this room appreciate and value. But this knowledge must be shared with the next generation, but with the general public. We need that information to be disseminated. It's no point, for example, doing research that only ends up with other researchers. The most important is for it to inform policy. So I really want to ask that, or request kindly, could we have a recommendation how this knowledge and what we are doing here is shared, and that policymakers get to know and hear about it, but then have a platform where they can go to check and find information. Thank you.
Thank you. And taking the scope of the room, anyone else? One more. One more. You have a question? Absolutely.
Statement? Yeah. So based on having listened to what our panelists were talking about, and also our member state representatives, if the international decade was extended, my question is, what strategies does the UN Wanki Group of African descent plan to employ in order to promote the active participation and collaboration of countries in the region to fully engage in international decade for people of African descent? Because over the past decade, there has been a lack of explicit program activities related to the decade, and how can we ensure that the next decade will not follow the same pattern, and what measures are being taken to address this historical gap in meaningful engagement and commitment?
Thank you. And I'm going to gather that question for the working group, unless there's somebody, you want to take an answer? No? We'll just...
Do we have time, Madam
No,
Chair?
we don't.
No,
So I
okay.
just want to make
But,
sure that we
of course-
capture that. So thank you for asking. Yeah, no, if you could do me a favor, though, could we do a sidebar on that, if you feel comfortable? Yeah, I don't feel comfortable just leaving it hanging, because it was a great question. So if we can do a sidebar, that would be fabulous. And I'm going to turn it back over to the chair. Thank you so much to our panelists. And on Zoom as well. Thank you for those of you who joined us on Zoom. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tracie, for your moderation of the second panel discussion on justice. I also would like to thank our distinguished and my sister-in-law panelists for their all of you for your enriching presentation, as well as the state's representative and meeting participants for their contribution. Definitely excellent recommendation were made, and I think they deserve to be taken into consideration. Yeah, and I fully support the, you have the possibility to have the side discussion, or maybe the question can be answered at a later stage. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr.